Welcome to Whispering Willow Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain arrived first, as it always did in Manchester, tapping against the warped glass of the anvil's crown with the persistence of a debt collector who knows your home. Inside, 3 men sat at a corner table, worn smooth by decades of elbows and secrets, their faces haloed by the amber glow of gas lamps that hissed softly overhead like gossips sharing the evening's scandals. The air was thick, not unpleasantly so, with the mingled scents of pipe tobacco, spilled porter, and the ever-present ghost of coal smoke that clung to everything in this city, from curtains to skin to the very thoughts one dared to think. It was November of 1893, and Manchester wore its industrial crown with all the grace of a boxer wearing a tiara, proud, defiant, and faintly ridiculous when examined too closely. Thomas Grimsby sat with his back to the wall, as he always did, one hand wrapped around a tankard that had been refilled more times than he could count with certainty. His fingers, stained permanently black beneath the nails from years in the dyeing sheds, drummed an anxious rhythm against the pewter. Something in his eyes, a flicker, a shadow, suggested he was seeing through the pub's dim interior to somewhere else entirely. Perhaps to the mills that dominated Manchester's skyline like iron cathedrals, their chimneys perpetually exhaling grey prayers into an indifferent sky. Beside him, Arthur Welland had loosened his collar to the point of impropriety, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and his normally meticulous appearance surrendered to the evening's liquid warmth. He was a clerk, had been for 15 years, in one of the cotton merchant houses that lined Mosley Street, those palatial buildings where fortunes were written in ledgers while outside the workers who made those fortunes possible coughed their lungs into handkerchiefs. Arthur's handwriting was impeccable. His life, he often thought, was not. The third man, Edward Carrick, possessed the weathered face of someone who'd spent more time outdoors than in, the kind of complexion that spoke of loading docks and railway yards and the brutal honesty of physical labour. His hands could crush walnuts without effort, yet tonight they trembled slightly as he raised his glass, though whether from the cold that seeped through the pub's walls or from something else entirely, one could not say. The anvil's crown occupied a corner where Deansgate slouched, into the tangle of streets that made up Castlefield, that curious district where Manchester's industrial ambitions had first learned to dream in iron and brick. The pub itself was unremarkable, in the way that old teeth are unremarkable, functional, familiar, and faintly yellow with age. Its wooden beams, darkened by decades of smoke, seemed to sag under the weight of conversations they'd absorbed, as if the very structure of the building had grown tired of men's confessions. Around the 3 friends, the pub breathed its nightly rhythms. A woman in a shawl too thin for the weather nursed a gin in the corner, her face turned toward the fire as if warmth alone could solve whatever mathematics of despair had brought her here. 2 dock workers argued good-naturedly about a football match, their accents thick as treacle, their laughter genuine despite the grime under their fingernails and the weariness in their bones. The barkeeper, a man named Hodge, who'd lost 3 fingers to a machine in his youth, polished glasses with practiced efficiency, his eyes noting everything while seeming to notice nothing at all. Manchester in the 1890s was a city of contradictions wrapped in soot. It had made itself the workshop of the world, its cotton mills processing the raw fibres of empire into the fabric of fortunes, its warehouses bulging with goods bound for every corner of the globe. The Manchester Ship Canal, that audacious engineering marvel, had recently transformed the landlocked city into a port, as if geography itself could be bent to Victorian will with sufficient determination and dynamite. Fortunes were made here with the regularity of rain, though they rarely fell into the hands of those who actually did the making. The city's architecture reflected this split personality. Grand civic buildings and merchant palaces rubbed shoulders with cramped terraces where families lived 6 to a room, where tuberculosis was as common as tea, and where children grew old before they grew tall. The Free Trade Hall stood proud on Peter Street, a temple to commercial liberty, while a stone's throw away, the slums of Angel Meadow festered with a poverty so profound it had earned the nickname Hell upon Earth from Friedrich Engels himself, who'd walked these streets decades earlier and found them wanting in basic humanity. But inside the anvil's crown, at least for this moment, such disparities seemed distant, softened by alcohol and the peculiar intimacy that comes when the hour grows late and men's guards grow low. To friendship, Thomas said suddenly, raising his tankard with a solemnity that seemed excessive, even for his current state of inebriation. His voice carried that particular thickness that comes when drink has loosened the tongue, but not yet fully claimed it. To friendship, and to justice. The last word hung in the smoky air, like a wrong note in a familiar song. Arthur and Edward exchanged glances, brief, loaded with something unspoken, before raising their own glasses. The clink of pewter on pewter rang hollow, or perhaps that was merely imagination painting the scene with foreknowledge. Justice, Arthur repeated, the word emerging from his mouth as if he were trying it on for size, testing its weight. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming now against the windows with increased urgency, as if the weather itself sensed something amiss and sought to wash it away before it could take root. Edward said nothing, only drank, his Adam's apple bobbing, as he swallowed what might have been porter, or might have been the last remnants of his better judgment. The 3 men had known each other since childhood, their friendship forged in the cramped streets of Ancoats, that densely packed district where the city's workers lived in the shadow of the very mills that employed them. They'd played in streets that ran with industrial waste, attended the same cheerless school where a harried teacher had attempted to drum literacy into 50 children simultaneously, shared their first cigarettes behind the gasworks, and generally navigated the precarious passage from boyhood to manhood with the solidarity that comes from shared circumstances. Time and fortune, or the lack of it, had not been equally kind. Thomas had found work in the dyeing trade, his hands forever stained, as proof. Arthur had managed to claw his way into a clerk's position, trading manual labour for the marginally more respectable drudgery of endless columns of figures. Edward had remained closest to their roots, his strength, his primary commodity, loading and unloading the goods that made other men wealthy. Yet they'd maintained their connection, meeting weekly at the Anvil's Crown, this neutral ground where the past could be honoured and the present endured through the simple ritual of shared drinks and comfortable silences, until tonight, when something had shifted. "Do you remember," Thomas began, his words now definitively slurred at the edges, "when we were boys, and we swore we'd always look out for each other, that we'd never let the bastards grind us down?" Arthur nodded slowly, his clerk's mind perhaps already calculating where this conversation might lead, and finding the sum troubling. "I remember. We were 12, standing on the bridge over the Medlock, throwing stones at bottles." "Young fools," Edward added, though his tone held more affection than criticism. "Thought we could take on the world." "Maybe we still can," Thomas said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that nevertheless carried clearly in the relatively quiet pub. "Maybe there's still time to make things right, to balance the scales." The fire crackled in its grate, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny doomed escape attempts. Somewhere deeper in the pub, a clock ticked steadily, marking time with mechanical indifference to whatever drama might be unfolding in its presence. "What are you saying, Tom?" Arthur asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew, or feared he knew. Thomas's laugh was bitter, emerging from somewhere deep and wounded. "I'm saying some men deserve what's coming to them. I'm saying that justice doesn't always arrive through proper channels. Sometimes it needs a helping hand." Edward's fingers tightened around his tankard, his knuckles going white. For a long moment he stared into the dark liquid, as if reading omens in its depths. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "That's dangerous talk, Tom, the kind that gets a man hanged." "Only if he's caught," Thomas replied, and there was something in his smile, something cold and decided, that seemed foreign to his face, as if he'd borrowed it from someone else, someone harder and less forgiving. "Only if he doesn't plan carefully." The rain continued its percussion against the windows, and within the Anvil's Crown the ordinary sounds of an evening wound on, glasses clinking, conversations murmuring, the fire settling into its coals. But at the corner table a silence had opened up, pregnant with possibility and danger in equal measure. It was Arthur who broke it, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" The question was simple, but its implications sprawled outward like cracks in ice. Thomas smiled again, and this time there was something almost relieved in his expression, as if he'd been carrying a weight and was grateful to finally share its burden. He leaned closer, and Arthur and Edward instinctively mirrored the movement, the three men forming a tight huddle that excluded the rest of the world. And there, in the amber-lit corner of the Anvil's Crown, with the rain as witness and the fire as confidant, Thomas Grimsby spoke a name, the name of a man. The name hung between them, solid and real as stone, and with it came a flood of shared memory. Grievances catalogued, injustices tallied, wounds both fresh and old, suddenly reopened and exposed to the smoky air. Each man at that table knew the name. Each man had reason to hate it. Each man had, in his private moments, perhaps wished the bearer of that name ill. But wishing and doing are separated by a chasm as wide as morality itself. "I'm serious," Thomas said, his voice steady now despite the alcohol, as if the act of speaking the plan aloud had sobered him somehow, focused him. "I've been thinking about it for months, planning. I know his routines, his habits. I know when he's vulnerable. Arthur's clerk's mind was already working through logistics, probabilities, consequences. The same skills he applied to merchant accounts now turned toward darker mathematics. His silence was thoughtful rather than dismissive. Edward simply stared, his weathered face unreadable, though his hands had ceased their trembling and now rested flat and still on the table's surface, as if anchoring himself against being swept away by the current of Thomas's words. "A pact," Thomas proposed, raising his tankard once more. "Between us, to see justice done, to make right what the law won't touch, what money has protected, a pact between brothers sealed here tonight." The fire popped loudly, and somewhere in the pub's depths that clock continued its steady ticking, measuring out the seconds in which decisions are made that cannot be unmade. Outside, Manchester slept and stirred in its usual patterns. The mills silent now, but waiting for dawn to call their workers back. The warehouses locked tight against thieves who coveted the empire's goods. The streets wet and glistening under gas lamps that painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. The River Irwell moved sluggishly through the city's heart, thick with industrial waste and secrets, while above it all the chimneys stood like sentinels, their daytime smoke replaced by night's relative clarity. It was a city built on ambition and exploitation, on progress and suffering, on the backs of men like these three who'd never see their names carved in marble, or commemorated in the grand histories that would someday chronicle this age. They were Manchester's invisible multitude, the ones who made but did not profit, who built but did not own, who suffered but were not acknowledged. And in that moment, in that corner, they held their tankards aloft in a gesture that was both pledge and prayer. "To justice," they said in unison, the word both bitter and sweet on their tongues. The pewter rang together once more, a sound like a bell tolling, and the pact was made. What none of them could know, what the rain obscured and the smoke concealed, was that this moment would be recorded not in the grand annals of Manchester's industrial triumphs, but in the darker register kept by those who investigate death rather than celebrate life. That within days the names of these three friends would become not a bond, but a puzzle, not a brotherhood, but a case file, not a pact, but evidence. And that the name they'd spoken, the man whose death they'd drunkenly sworn to accomplish, would prove to be a mirror, in which each of them would see not the face of their enemy, but the reflection of their own desperate hearts. The fire burned lower, the rain eased to a drizzle, and in the anvil's crown 3 men finished their drinks and prepared to step out into a Manchester night that had no idea it had just witnessed the beginning of a tragedy that would require the finest detective mind of the age to unravel. The clock struck 11, and its chimes rang out like a countdown that had already begun. The morning came to Manchester the way it always did, reluctantly, and with a grey veil drawn across the sky, as if the city itself were in mourning for the night just past. The factories had already been awake for hours, their whistles shrieking at 5 o'clock to summon the bleary-eyed workers from their cramped beds, their chimneys now pouring forth the coal smoke that would hang over the city, like a pall, until evening persuaded it to settle into the streets and courtyards, coating everything in a fine, gritty film that no amount of scrubbing could entirely erase. Detective Inspector Gregson of the Manchester Police stood in the narrow alley off Swan Street, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his overcoat, his breath forming small clouds in the December air. He was a local man, born within sound of the factory bells, and he knew this city's darker corners with the intimacy of long acquaintance. He'd seen bodies pulled from the canals, workers crushed by machinery, domestic disputes turned fatal, and the occasional murder that spoke of calculation rather than passion. But this was something different. Behind him, the alley's brick walls rose 3 stories high, blackened by decades of industrial exhaust, their mortar crumbling in places where frost and neglect had done their patient work. A single gas lamp, still burning though dawn had arrived, cast wavering shadows across the scene. The ground was cobbled, uneven, treacherous with ice in the shadowed portions where the weak winter sun couldn't reach, and there, sprawled against the base of the wall in a posture that spoke of violent conclusion, lay the body of Arthur Welland, or what remained of him. Gregson had sent a constable to fetch the police surgeon, though there was little mystery about the cause of death. Arthur's throat had been cut with such force that his head was nearly severed from his body, the wound gaping obscenely in the morning light, the blood that had fountained from it now frozen in dark, rust-coloured patterns across the cobblestones. His eyes were still open, staring upward at nothing, their expression one of terminal surprise, as if death had arrived from an unexpected quarter, wearing an unfamiliar face. His pockets had been turned out, their contents scattered. A few coins, a handkerchief monogrammed with his initials, a tarnished pocket watch that had stopped at 10 minutes past 2. Whether this was robbery or merely an attempt to make it appear so, Gregson couldn't yet say. But something about the scene troubled him, some discord he couldn't quite name, like a note played sharp in an otherwise familiar melody. The clerk's coat was expensive, or had been once, good wool, well tailored, the kind of garment a man bought when he first achieved a position of minor respectability and wanted the world to know it. Now it was ruined, stiff with frozen blood, the fabric torn where the killer's blade had apparently caught it during the struggle. For there had been a struggle, that much was evident. Arthur's hands bore defensive wounds, deep cuts across the palms where he'd tried to ward off the attack, one finger nearly severed. He'd fought then, fought hard, but not well enough. "Poor bastard," muttered Constable Thorne, a young man whose enthusiasm for police work had not yet been ground down by the realities of Manchester's streets. He stood a respectful distance from the body, his face pale beneath his helmet, his notebook clutched in hands that trembled slightly. Whether from cold or from the presence of death, Gregson couldn't determine. "Do we know who he is, sir?" "Arthur Welland," Gregson replied, his voice flat, professional. "Clerk at Thornbury and Sons, the cotton merchants on Mosley Street. Lived in lodgings on Balloon Street, respectable enough. 32 years old, unmarried, had a sister in Salford, I believe." He paused, studying the body with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned to see past horror to the facts it concealed. "Someone will need to inform her. That's always the worst part of this work, Thorne. Remember that. The bodies are just puzzles. It's the living who suffer." The alley opened onto Swan Street at one end and terminated in a dead end at the other, where it met the blank brick wall of a warehouse. No windows overlooked this particular stretch, no convenient witnesses to report what they'd seen or heard. The killer had chosen well, or had been fortunate in his desperation. This was the kind of place where a man could die, and the city would simply step over him come morning, too busy with its own survival to mourn a stranger. But Arthur Welland had not been killed here. That much was clear. The blood pooling beneath him was substantial, yes, but not nearly enough for a wound of that severity. He'd been killed elsewhere and dumped here, his body arranged almost carefully against the wall, as if the murderer had wanted him found, but not immediately, had sought to buy himself time for what? Flight? The destruction of evidence? Or perhaps merely a few hours' sleep before the machinery of justice began its grinding work. Gregson crouched beside the body, his knees cracking audibly in the cold air, and began his examination with the thoroughness that had earned him his position despite his working-class origins. The frozen blood made certain details difficult to discern, but he noted that Arthur's collar stud was missing, torn away, perhaps, during the attack. His shoes were expensive, barely worn, the kind a man might save for weeks to afford. They were muddy, but the mud was dry, frozen into the crevices of the sole. Old mud, then, not fresh from tonight's rain. In Arthur's inside coat pocket, Gregson found a leather wallet containing £3 7 shillings, a small fortune for a clerk, enough to rule out simple robbery as the motive, though a clever killer might leave the money to suggest other causes. There was also a carte de visite, the photograph of a young woman with serious eyes and a mouth that suggested she didn't smile easily. No inscription, no name. A sweetheart? A sister? The dead kept their secrets until the living could piece them together from fragments. And then, tucked into the very bottom of the wallet, almost overlooked, Gregson found it. A scrap of paper, no larger than a calling card, burnt along one edge, so that perhaps half of it was missing, consumed by flame. The remaining portion bore writing in 3 distinct hands, hurried, urgent, the ink smudged in places, as if fingers had touched it while still wet. The words that remained were fragmentary, incomplete. And agreed, then. The 15th of December. Must not fail, for justice and the Cathedral at midnight. Bring, and then, most curious of all, a single word in what appeared to be a fourth hand. This one steadier, more deliberate. Observed. Gregson turned the burnt scrap carefully, holding it up to the weak morning light. The paper was of ordinary quality, the kind used for correspondence or notes, nothing distinctive. But the writing itself, 3 separate hands contributing to what appeared to be a shared document, a pact or plan of some kind, was decidedly unusual. And that word, observed, added in a different ink, suggested someone had been watching, recording, perhaps even anticipating what the others had plotted. The 15th of December. That was tomorrow. "Sir," Thorne ventured, his curiosity overcoming his discomfort. "What is it?" Gregson didn't answer immediately. His mind was already working through possibilities, constructing narratives that might fit the evidence. 3 people, at least 3, perhaps 4, involved in some kind of conspiracy or plan, something scheduled to occur tomorrow night at a cathedral. But which cathedral? Manchester had several. And what was the nature of their agreement? And who was the 4th person, the observer who'd added that single, ominous word? More pressingly, where were the other 2 conspirators? If Arthur Welland had been part of a group of 3, what had become of his companions? Were they also lying in frozen alleys, their throats opened to the winter air? Or were they? And here Gregson felt the familiar chill that came with a darker possibility. Were they the killers, rather than the killed? The police surgeon arrived then, a dour Scotsman named Mackenzie, who'd seen enough death in his 40 years to view it with clinical detachment. He examined the body with efficient thoroughness, his fingers probing the wound, checking for lividity and rigor mortis, taking the body's temperature with a small thermometer he produced from his bag. "Dead 6 to 8 hours, Mackenzie pronounced, straightening with a grunt. "Probably closer to 8. Killed elsewhere, certainly. There's not enough blood here. The weapon was extremely sharp, wielded with considerable force. Single stroke, left to right, which suggests a right-handed attacker standing behind or beside the victim. The defensive wounds on the hands came first, so he saw it coming, tried to stop it. Didn't manage." He paused, studying Arthur's frozen face. He knew his killer, I'd wager. Got close enough to be embraced before he realized the embrace was deadly. "Professional?" Gregson asked. Mackenzie shrugged. "Hard to say. The cut is clean, efficient, but rage can make anyone efficient. I've seen dockers do work as precise as surgeons when their blood is up. I'd need to examine the wound more thoroughly back at the morgue to say for certain." As the surgeon directed his assistants in preparing the body for transport, Gregson stood and surveyed the alley once more, committing every detail to memory. The way the morning light fell across the cobblestones, the pattern of the blood, the position of Arthur's hands, one reaching outward as if grasping for help that hadn't come. This was a story written in violence and silence, and Gregson's job was to read it accurately enough to prevent its sequel. But he knew, with the certainty of long experience, that this case had already grown beyond his capabilities. The burnt scrap of paper, with its fragmentary message, the suggestion of conspiracy, the calculated nature of the murder despite its brutal execution. These pointed toward complexities that required a mind more suited to untangling elaborate webs than his own straightforward investigative methods could manage. Manchester had its share of capable detectives. Gregson was among them. But for something like this, something that smelled of premeditation and multiple participants and secrets that ran deeper than a simple grudge or drunken argument, they needed someone exceptional. They needed, Gregson thought with a mixture of resentment and relief, Sherlock Holmes. By midday, Gregson had dispatched a telegram to London, briefly outlining the case's salient features and requesting Holmes's assistance. He'd worked with the consulting detective before, on a case involving smuggled opium and a dead merchant, whose murder had initially been ruled a suicide. Holmes had arrived, spent 3 hours examining the scene, questioned half a dozen people Gregson had already questioned, and within 24 hours had identified the killer with such precision that even the accused had seemed impressed before confessing. Gregson didn't particularly like Holmes. The man's superior attitude grated against his northern sensibilities, and his methods seemed to involve showing up other policemen's oversights with unnecessary flair. But he couldn't deny the results. And if Arthur Welland's murder was indeed part of something larger, something involving secret pacts and scheduled violence, then pride was a luxury Manchester couldn't afford. While waiting for a response from London, Gregson set about the methodical work of investigation. He visited Thornbury and Sons, that imposing building of Portland stone and self-importance on Mosley Street, where Manchester's cotton merchants played at being merchant princes. The senior partner, a Mr. Thornbury himself, portly, prosperous, with mutton-chop whiskers that proclaimed his Victorian respectability as loudly as a brass band, expressed suitable shock at Arthur's demise. A fine clerk, Thornbury intoned, shaking his head with what might have been genuine sorrow, or might have been mere performance. Punctual, accurate, never gave us a moment's trouble. 15 years he'd been with us. Started as a junior clerk, worked his way up. Exemplary record. He paused, his brow furrowing. Though, now that I think on it, he'd seemed distracted these past weeks. Preoccupied. Made a few errors in his ledgers. Nothing serious, but unusual for him. I'd meant to speak with him about it. Did he have enemies? Gregson asked. Anyone who might wish him harm? Thornbury's expression suggested the question was absurd. Enemies? He was a clerk, Inspector. He added columns of figures and recorded shipments. Who makes enemies doing that? But Gregson knew better. Anyone could make enemies. A clerk who discovered embezzlement. A man who refused to falsify records. Someone who knew too much about transactions that preferred darkness to scrutiny. The respectable world of commerce had its own violence, subtle and bloodless, until suddenly it wasn't. He interviewed Arthur's fellow clerks, a dozen men in dark suits who sat at high desks in a room that smelled of ink and coal dust and quiet desperation. They spoke well of Arthur, or at least spoke nothing ill, a distinction Gregson had learned to recognize. He'd been private, they said, kept to himself, did his work and went home. Occasionally took a pint with friends from his younger days, working men, not the sort one would expect a clerk to associate with. But Arthur had never forgotten his origins, they said, which was meant as praise, but carried an undercurrent of something else. Class consciousness. The suggestion that Arthur hadn't fully belonged to their world of collars and cuffs, that some part of him remained in the sooty streets of his childhood. Gregson made note of the friends. Working men. A pint. That suggested the Anvil's Crown, or one of the other pubs in Castlefield, where clerks and labourers might meet on equal terms, where the boundaries of class became permeable, in the democratic haze of alcohol and shared grievance. From Mosley Street, he made his way to Balloon Street and Arthur's lodgings, a narrow house divided into rooms for single men, presided over by a Mrs. Caldwell, whose suspicious nature made her an excellent witness, despite her obvious disapproval of police in general, and Gregson in particular. He was a good tenant, she declared, arms crossed over her ample bosom. Paid on time, didn't drink to excess, no women visiting at improper hours. Quiet as a mouse he was. Spent his evenings reading, mostly. Had aspirations, I suppose. Wanted to better himself. She sniffed. Lot of good it did him. Arthur's room was small, spare, heartbreakingly neat. A narrow bed with a thin quilt. A washstand with a chipped basin. A small desk beneath the window where the light would be best for reading or writing. Bookshelves improvised from planks and bricks, holding a modest library. Dickens, George Eliot, some poetry, and, interestingly, several volumes on law and justice. A man educating himself, reaching towards something beyond his current station. On the desk, Gregson found writing materials, good quality paper, a steel-nibbed pen, an inkwell half empty. And in the desk's single drawer, beneath a stack of letters from the sister in Salford, he found what he'd been seeking. More fragments, more pieces of the puzzle. A notebook, its pages filled with Arthur's meticulous handwriting, recording what appeared to be observations, dates, times, locations. Tuesday, November 12th, left warehouse at 6:45 p.m, proceeded via usual route. Friday, November 22nd, took carriage to Cheetham Hill, remained 3 hours. The entries went back months. a record of someone's movements, someone's habits, compiled with the same precision Arthur brought to his ledgers at Thornbury and Sons. But nowhere did the notebook reveal whose movements were being tracked. The subject was referred to only as Orch, or, occasionally, the target. Yet the obsessive detail suggested not casual curiosity, but determined purpose. Arthur had been planning something, preparing for something, and that something required knowing another person's routines with intimate accuracy. The same attention to detail, Gregson realized with a cold settling in his stomach, that a murderer might need. Had Arthur been planning to kill someone? And if so, had his own murder been preemptive? A victim striking back before becoming victimized? Or had something gone wrong with a conspiracy that included at least 2 others? Something that had turned the plotters against each other? The burnt scrap of paper crackled in Gregson's pocket as he shifted position, a reminder of incomplete information, of secrets still concealed. Outside Arthur's window, Manchester continued its daily business. Carts rattled past bearing goods to and from the warehouses. Women in shawls hurried toward the markets, their breaths forming clouds in the cold air. A chimney sweep, his face blackened beyond any washing, called out for custom in a voice roughened by coal dust. The city that had made Arthur Welland and then unmade him went on as if he'd never existed, as if his small aspirations and careful observations and violent death were no more significant than a raindrop in the perpetual Manchester drizzle. But Gregson knew better. Every death mattered, even if only to show the living that their own mortality was never as distant as they imagined. Every murder was a puzzle that demanded solving, not merely for justice, though justice mattered, but because unsolved murders were like open wounds, festering, spreading infection through the body of society. He pocketed the notebook and prepared to leave. There were other inquiries to make, other threads to pull. The sister in Salford would need to be informed, her grief witnessed and her knowledge plumbed for any insight she might possess. The friends Arthur drank with would need to be found and questioned. And somewhere in this city of iron and ambition, there were at least 2 other people who'd contributed to that burnt scrap of paper, 2 others who knew what was meant to happen at the cathedral tomorrow night, if they were still alive. As Gregson descended the narrow stairs, Mrs. Caldwell called after him, "Inspector, will you catch who did this? Will there be justice?" He turned, studying her face, harder than it should be, worn by years of taking in lodgers and asking no questions, because questions reduced profits. But genuine concern showed in her eyes now, a reminder that even the most hardened heart could be moved by murder's proximity. "Yes," he said simply, "there will be justice." It was a promise he hoped he could keep, though he suspected the definition of justice in this case might prove more complicated than a simple hanging. Outside, the afternoon was already fading toward evening, the winter sun giving up its brief appearance without much fight. Gas lamps were being lit along the streets, their yellow glow pushing back the gathering dark with only moderate success. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle blew, marking shift change, and Manchester's thousands responded like a great organism. One part going home, while another part arrived to take its place at the machines. And in that flow of humanity, anonymous and unremarkable, walked the person, or persons, who'd killed Arthur Welland and dumped his body in an alley like refuse. Tomorrow was the 15th. Tomorrow night, whatever had been planned would either occur or fail to occur. and tomorrow, if the telegram did its work, Sherlock Holmes would arrive in Manchester with his sharp eyes and sharper mind, ready to see what Gregson had missed, to connect what seemed unconnectable. Until then, there was nothing to do but wait and watch and hope that no more bodies appeared in frozen alleys, their throats opened to the unforgiving sky. The city exhaled smoke. The rain began again. And somewhere in the maze of Manchester's streets, truth waited to be uncovered, patient as stone, inevitable as morning. The train from London arrived at Manchester's London Road station precisely at 9:30 the following morning, disgorging its passengers into a world painted in shades of grey and sepia, where the smoke from 1,000 chimneys wove itself into the fog, until one couldn't say where industry ended and weather began. Among those passengers, tall and angular, moving with the purposeful grace of a man who knew exactly where he was going, despite never having been there before, was Sherlock Holmes. Dr. John Watson followed half a step behind, his medical bag in one hand and his travelling case in the other, his eyes already taking in the organised chaos of the station. The porters shouting, the vendors hawking newspapers and meat pies, the great vaulted ceiling that trapped the smoke and noise and sent it echoing back down upon the crowds below. He'd been to Manchester once before, years ago, during his army days, and remembered it as a city that never quite stopped moving, as if perpetual motion were the only thing preventing it from collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Remarkable, Holmes murmured, pausing at the station's entrance to survey the street beyond. The very air here is different, Watson. Can you smell it? Coal, certainly, and iron, and cotton dust, but beneath that, ambition, desperation, the scent of a city that has built itself through sheer force of will and is determined never to stop building, regardless of the cost. Watson, who could primarily smell coal smoke and something vaguely unpleasant from a nearby drain, simply nodded. He'd long ago learned that Holmes perceived the world through senses more finely tuned than his own, that his friend could read entire histories in the pattern of mud on a boot, or the way a man held his shoulders. Detective Inspector Gregson was waiting for them just outside the station, looking even more careworn than when Watson had last seen him in London. The northern climate had not been kind to the man's complexion, which bore the ruddy marks of cold wind and poor circulation, and his eyes carried the particular weariness of someone who'd spent the night attempting sleep while his mind refused to cooperate. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Gregson greeted them with a nod that managed to convey both relief at their arrival and resentment at needing them. "Thank you for coming so quickly. The case has developed since I sent the telegram." "Another body?" Holmes asked sharply, his grey eyes suddenly alert. "No, thank God. But I've learned more about the first victim, and none of it makes the picture clearer. If anything, it's grown more complex." Gregson gestured toward a waiting hansom cab. "I'll explain on the way. I've arranged for you to examine the body and the evidence at the station. We've kept both as pristine as circumstances allow." The cab carried them through Manchester's morning streets, and Watson found himself transfixed by the city's contrasts. Grand buildings of civic pride, the Free Trade Hall, the Town Hall with its Gothic spires reaching toward a heaven perpetually obscured by smoke, stood mere streets away from cramped terraces where laundry hung like surrender flags in the sooty air. Children played in gutters, their faces bright with the resilience of youth despite the grime that seemed to coat everything. Women hurried past with market baskets, their shawls drawn tight against the December cold. And everywhere the sound of industry, hammering, grinding, the shriek of metal on metal, the deep throb of engines that never ceased. This was the engine room of empire, Watson thought. This was where the raw materials of conquest were transformed into the finished goods that flooded the world's markets, making fortunes for the few, and providing bare subsistence for the many who actually did the transforming. The victim's name was Arthur Welland, Gregson began, pulling a notebook from his coat. 32 years old, clerk at Thornbury, sons, cotton merchants. Found yesterday morning in an alley off Swan Street, throat cut, dead approximately 8 hours at the time of discovery. No robbery. He still had money in his pockets. But in his wallet, I found this. He handed Holmes the burnt scrap of paper, carefully preserved now between two pieces of glass. Holmes held it up to the cab's window, letting what passed for Manchester's daylight illuminate the fragmentary text. His eyes moving rapidly across the words, his lips compressed in concentration. 3 hands, he said immediately. No, 4. This word observed is added later. Different ink, steadier pressure. The paper was deliberately burnt, not accidentally. See how the flame was applied to this specific edge? Someone wanted to destroy this, but was interrupted, or changed their mind, or perhaps intended to leave just enough to tantalize. He turned the glass, examining the scrap from different angles. The 15th of December, that's today. Tonight specifically, Gregson confirmed. It mentions a cathedral at midnight. But we have several churches in Manchester that might qualify as cathedrals. St. Mary's, the cathedral itself, even some of the larger Methodist chapels. I've posted men at the most likely locations, but subtly. If someone is planning to meet there, I don't want to frighten them off. Wise? Holmes murmured, still studying the fragment. Tell me about Welland, everything you've learned. As the cab rattled through Ancoats, that dense warren of streets where Manchester's working poor lived in conditions that would shame a medieval serf, Gregson recounted his investigation. Arthur's respectable position, his modest lodgings, his habit of meeting with friends from his working-class past. The notebook found in his room, with its meticulous observations of someone referred to only as H, or the target. The statements from colleagues describing Arthur as preoccupied in recent weeks, making uncharacteristic errors. Holmes listened with that peculiar stillness he adopted when his mind was most active, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Watson, who'd witnessed this posture countless times, knew better than to interrupt. His friend was constructing theories, building and demolishing hypotheses at a speed that would exhaust a lesser intellect, testing each against the available evidence until something fit with the precision of a well-made lock accepting its key. The friends, Holmes said suddenly, the ones he drank with, have you identified them? Not yet, Gregson admitted. I've made inquiries at the public houses in Castlefield, where Welland was known to go. Several barkeeps remember him, usually in company with 2 other men. One a dyer, they thought, the other possibly a dock worker or railway man. But I've no names yet. 3 men, Holmes mused. 3 hands on that paper, plus the observer. A conspiracy of some kind, a pact made, and then... He opened his eyes fully, fixing Gregson with a penetrating stare. You believe Welland was planning a murder, that this H in his notebook was his intended victim? It seems likely, Gregson said carefully. The level of detail in those observations, that's not casual curiosity. That's preparation. Indeed. But consider this, Inspector. If 3 men are conspiring to commit murder, and one of them is killed, what does that suggest about the other 2? Watson saw it immediately. That they've turned on each other, or that someone else discovered their plan and is eliminating them one by one. Precisely, my dear Watson. Holmes's smile was grim, which means we may have 2 more bodies before this matter concludes. Unless... He fell silent again, his eyes distant. Unless the pattern is more complex than it first appears. The cab had reached the police station now, a sturdy building of blackened brick that proclaimed civic authority with the subtlety of a cudgel. Inside, the air was warmer, but hardly more pleasant, carrying the institutional smell of carbolic soap, damp wool, and the particular staleness that accumulates in places where people would rather not be. Gregson led them to a basement room kept deliberately cold for the storage of bodies awaiting burial or post-mortem examination. Arthur Welland lay on a zinc table, covered by a sheet that Gregson pulled back with practiced efficiency. The wound to his throat was even more shocking in the artificial light of the gas lamps, a gaping canyon that spoke of tremendous force and possibly rage. Holmes approached the body with no visible emotion, his examination methodical and thorough. He studied the defensive wounds on Arthur's hands, the pattern of blood on his clothing, the condition of his fingernails, and the calluses on his palms. He used a magnifying lens to examine the wound itself, measuring its dimensions with a small tape he produced from his pocket, noting the precise angle of the cut. The blade was approximately 6 inches long, he announced after several minutes. Very sharp. A razor, perhaps, or a well-honed knife. The killer stood beside him, not behind, as the police surgeon suggested. See here. He pointed to a secondary, shallower cut near the first. This is a hesitation mark. The killer began the cut, stopped, then completed it with greater force. That suggests either uncertainty or the need to adjust position. What does that tell us? Watson asked. That our killer is not a professional assassin, nor someone accustomed to violence. This was personal, intimate, but not practiced. Someone who knew what they intended to do, but had never done it before. Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful. The defensive wounds are extensive, which means Welland fought hard. He was a clerk, not a labourer. Yet he managed to resist long enough to sustain multiple cuts to his hands. Why didn't he cry out? This attack lasted at least 20 or 30 seconds, long enough for shouting. Perhaps his throat was cut first, Gregson suggested. Then the defensive wounds would be shallower, weaker, delivered by a dying man. But these, Holmes gestured to Arthur's hands, show full strength, full desperation. No, he was conscious and capable throughout most of the attack, which suggests it occurred somewhere no one would hear, or where shouting wouldn't matter. Watson leaned closer, his medical training engaged, despite his revulsion. The blood has frozen in the wound. That suggests he was outside when killed, or moved outside immediately after death. Excellent, Watson. Yes, killed outside or moved there within minutes. And notice the pattern of blood on his coat. It's concentrated on the right side, which confirms Holmes's observation about the killer's position. But there's something else. He bent lower, examining the fabric. These small tears in the cloth, here and around the collar, they're not from the blade. They're from something else, something with irregular edges. Holmes produced a pair of tweezers from his pocket and carefully extracted something from one of the tiers. A tiny fragment of what appeared to be rust or oxidized metal. He held it up to the light, his eyes narrowing. "Iron," he pronounced. "Old iron, heavily corroded. Our victim caught his coat on something iron and rusty during his struggle, something with sharp, irregular edges, and given the position of these tiers, all on the upper portion of the coat and collar, something at approximately head height." "A fence?" Watson ventured. "Possibly, or machinery of some kind, or—" Holmes paused, a strange expression crossing his face. "Or ironwork, decorative ironwork, the kind one might find surrounding a church or cathedral." The three men looked at each other as the implications settled over them like Manchester's ever-present fog. "He was killed at the cathedral," Gregson said slowly. "Or near it, the very place mentioned in the note." "It would appear so," Holmes agreed, "though which cathedral remains to be determined. And whether the murder occurred before the midnight meeting mentioned in the note, or was itself the purpose of that meeting." He covered Arthur's body again, his movements surprisingly gentle. "You mentioned that Welland seemed preoccupied in recent weeks. Did anyone specify when this distraction began?" Gregson consulted his notes. His employer thought it started in early November. The first error in his ledgers was dated November 7th. Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed something. "And the notebook recording H's movements? What was the date of the first entry?" "November 12th. 5 days later. So something happened in early November that set these events in motion. Something that caused Arthur Welland to begin making mistakes in his work. Something that led him to begin tracking another person's movements with obsessive detail. Something that eventually resulted in his participation in a conspiracy with at least 2 other men." Holmes began pacing the small room, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to find those 2 men, Inspector. Find them quickly, before they share Welland's fate, or before they complete whatever they planned for tonight." "I've men making inquiries," Gregson assured him. "Every public house in Castlefield and Ancoats, showing Welland's photograph, asking about his companions. Someone will remember them." "Time is not our ally," Holmes said sharply. "It's already past noon. Whatever is planned for midnight gives us less than 12 hours. And somewhere in this city of— what is Manchester's population, Watson?" "Nearly 500,000, I believe." "Precisely. Somewhere among 500,000 souls are the answers we seek. 2 men who shared Welland's conspiracy. 1 person they planned to kill, and a 4th individual who wrote observed on their pact. Someone who knew what they intended and was watching them." Watson felt the familiar thrill that came with these investigations, the sense of pieces scattered across a table, waiting to be assembled into a coherent picture. But beneath it ran a current of unease. Manchester was not London, where Holmes knew every corner and alley, where his network of informants, his Baker Street irregulars, and various contacts, could be mobilized within hours. Here they were strangers, dependent on local knowledge and the limited resources of a provincial police force. "There's something else you should see," Gregson said, leading them to an evidence table where Arthur's belongings had been carefully laid out and catalogued. The wallet, the pocket watch, the monogrammed handkerchief, and the notebook, its pages filled with those meticulous observations. Holmes seized upon it immediately, flipping through the pages with the intensity of a scholar examining a newly discovered manuscript. His eyes moved rapidly across Arthur's handwriting, absorbing the patterns, the habits, the obsessive documentation of someone's daily life. "Our H is a man of routine," he murmured. "Leaves his residence, unspecified location, each morning at 8. Takes the same route to his place of business, also unspecified. Returns via the same route at 6 in the evening, except on Fridays, when he remains until 7. Dines at the same restaurant, the establishment on King Street, every Thursday. Attends church, the large church, on Sundays. Visits a residence in Cheetham Hill every Saturday afternoon." He looked up. "This is a middle-class professional, someone whose life is ordered and predictable, someone with enough prosperity to afford routine dining out and carriage rides to Cheetham Hill." "A businessman," Watson suggested. "Almost certainly. Cotton merchant, perhaps, or someone involved in the textile trade. This is Manchester, after all. Nearly every fortune here has cotton at its root." Holmes closed the notebook. But what did this man do to earn the murderous attention of 3 working men? What crime or cruelty provoked such careful planning? "Perhaps he wronged them," Gregson offered, "cheated them, or caused them injury." Possible. But why work together? If 3 separate men all wanted the same person dead and didn't know of each other's intentions, that suggests this H has harmed multiple people in the same way. A pattern of behavior, not a single incident. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the light of the hunt. "We need to find that pattern, Inspector. Find it in the next few hours, or I fear this case will conclude with more death than we can prevent." Outside the police station, Manchester continued its relentless routine. Factory whistles marked the hour. Trams clanged along their rails, carrying workers and clerks and shoppers through streets that never seemed to empty. The Irwell flowed sluggishly through the city's heart, its waters dark with industrial waste, its bridges crowded with traffic. And somewhere in this vast, churning mechanism of human ambition and suffering, 2 men walked, or worked, or waited, unaware that a detective from London was racing against time to find them. Or perhaps they were aware. Perhaps they knew exactly what they'd done and what they planned to do. Perhaps even now they were preparing for tonight's midnight meeting, checking their weapons, rehearsing their courage, steeling themselves for the act that had already claimed one of their number. The afternoon stretched ahead, grey and cold and full of secrets. Manchester had no intention of revealing without a fight. But Sherlock Holmes had faced reluctant cities before. He'd extracted confessions from stones and found truth in the smallest grain of displaced dust. If answers existed, he would find them. Watson only hoped they'd find them before the cathedral bells tolled midnight, and whatever dark appointment waited, there came due. The burnt paper fragment crackled again in Gregson's pocket, and somewhere in the distance a church clock began to strike the hour, each chime falling like a countdown toward an unknown conclusion. The afternoon light, such as it was in Manchester, where the sun seemed to surrender before it even properly rose, painted the city in shades of amber and shadow, as Holmes, Watson, and Gregson made their way through Castlefield. This was the district where Manchester's industrial ambitions had first taken root, where the Bridgewater Canal had opened in 1761 and inaugurated the age of inland waterways that would transform Britain from an agricultural nation into the workshop of the world. Now, more than a century later, the area bore the accumulated scars of that transformation. warehouses looming like brick cathedrals, their walls blackened by coal smoke, their windows broken or boarded, their purpose slowly being superseded by the railway and the Manchester Ship Canal. Yet life persisted here, with the stubborn tenacity of weeds growing through cobblestones. Public houses occupied the ground floors, of buildings that threatened to collapse, their signs creaking in the wind that channeled through the narrow streets. Small shops sold bread and coal and the thousand mundane necessities that kept Manchester's working poor alive from one day to the next. Children played in courtyards where washing hung like defeated flags, their laughter rising above the perpetual rumble of distant machinery. Holmes had insisted they come here, to the territory where Arthur Welland had maintained his connection to his origins, where clerk and labourer could meet on equal ground, and where secrets might be shared over ale in rooms too crowded for anyone to pay particular attention, to three men huddled in conversation. The anvil's crown announced itself with a weather-beaten sign depicting a crown being hammered on an anvil, a piece of visual wit that must have seemed clever to someone once, though time and soot had rendered the image nearly illegible. The pub occupied a corner building whose architecture suggested Georgian origins, before Manchester had truly exploded into industrial prominence, when it had still been possible to imagine the city as something other than an engine for producing wealth and consuming lives. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, and the yeasty smell of beer, cut through with the sharper scents of unwashed bodies and damp wool. Gas lamps burned even in afternoon, their light unable to penetrate the gloom that seemed endemic to the place. The floor was strewn with sawdust that had long ago given up attempting to absorb what was spilled upon it. Men sat at rough tables, their faces weathered and weary, their conversations conducted in low tones punctuated by occasional laughter that had more edge than humour. The barkeeper was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and missing 3 fingers from his left hand, a common enough injury in a city where machinery cared nothing for human flesh. His name, Gregson had learned from earlier inquiries, was Hodge, and he possessed the particular quality of seeming to see everything while appearing to notice nothing, a skill essential to anyone who wished to keep a public house in a district where discretion was more valuable than the ale itself. Holmes approached the bar with the confidence of a man who'd spent half his life in such establishments, though Watson knew his friend's actual preferences ran more toward Turkish tobacco and violin solos than public house camaraderie. Still, Holmes had the chameleon's gift of adaptation, and within moments he'd ordered 3 pints and engaged Hodge in conversation with the ease of an old regular. "Sad business about Arthur Welland," Holmes said, accepting his pint with a nod of thanks. "I understand he was often in here." Hodge's expression, already closed, seemed to shudder further. "Police already asked about him. I told them what I knew, which wasn't much. He came in, had his drinks, left. Not my business what else he did." "Of course not," Holmes agreed, smoothly. "But his friends, the men he drank with, they must be devastated. Someone should inform them, if the police haven't already." "Don't know who you mean." Hodge began polishing a glass with mechanical efficiency, his eyes fixed on some point past Holmes's shoulder. Holmes sipped his pint, grimaced slightly at what Watson suspected was execrable quality, and tried a different approach. "I'm not police, Mr. Hodge. I'm a private detective from London, hired by Arthur's sister to understand what happened to her brother. She deserves to know the truth. don't you think? She deserves to understand why a respectable clerk ended up in an alley with his throat cut. Something flickered in Hodge's face. Sympathy, perhaps, or merely the calculation of a man weighing the value of information against the risk of providing it. His sister, you say? A schoolteacher in Salford, a good woman who loved her brother and can't understand how this happened. The lie came easily to Holmes, wrapped in just enough truth to be convincing. Arthur did have a sister, after all, even if she hadn't hired anyone. Hodge set down the glass and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Look, I don't want trouble. This isn't the kind of place where people appreciate questions, if you take my meaning. But Arthur was a decent sort, always polite, always paid his tab, didn't deserve what happened to him. His friends, Holmes pressed gently, the men he drank with regularly, they'd want to know, surely. Tom Grimsby, Hodge said finally, the name emerging like a confession. Dyer, works in the chemical sheds down by the Earwell. Been coming here 15 years, maybe more. And Eddie Carrick, Edward Carrick, dock worker, strong as an ox but gentle enough when he's sober. The three of them, they grew up together, I gather. Childhood friends. Used to meet here every Tuesday evening, regular as church. He paused. Haven't seen either of them since last Tuesday night, though. The night before Arthur was found. Watson felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when an investigation suddenly focused, when the scattered pieces began arranging themselves into recognizable patterns. Last Tuesday night. The night the pact was made, if the burnt fragment was to be believed. The night before Arthur's murder. You remember that evening? Holmes asked, his tone carefully casual. Anything unusual about it? Hodge's eyes grew distant, remembering. They were drinking more than usual. Started early, around 7, and were still here past 11 when I called last orders. And they were intense, if that's the word. Not arguing, exactly. But there was something happening between them. Something serious. They sat in that corner. He pointed to a table near the fireplace, currently occupied by 2 old men playing dominoes. Heads together, talking low. Couldn't hear what they said, and didn't try. Not my business. Were they drunk? Watson interjected. Oh, certainly. By the end of the evening, all 3 were well into their cups, but still coherent, still purposeful. Sometimes drink makes men foolish. Sometimes it makes them brave. That night, it seemed to be making them brave. Holmes drained his pint, despite its quality, and set the tankard down with a definitive thunk. Where might we find Thomas Grimsby and Edward Carrick? The sister will want to speak with them, I'm certain. Hodge provided addresses with the grudging air of someone who knew he'd already said too much, but couldn't quite stop himself. Grimsby lodged in a tenement in Ancoats, near the dye works where he was employed. Carrick lived closer, in a boarding house on Liverpool Road that catered to transient labourers and men whose lives hadn't quite achieved the stability required for more permanent accommodations. As they left the Anvil's Crown, stepping back into Manchester's grey afternoon, Watson noticed that Holmes's expression had taken on that peculiar intensity that indicated his mind was racing through possibilities at speeds that would exhaust a lesser intellect. They're alive, then, Gregson said, relief evident in his voice. Or they were as of this morning, at least. That's something. Is it? Holmes replied sharply. Consider the timeline, Inspector. Arthur is killed sometime after 2 in the morning on Wednesday. His body is discovered Wednesday morning. Today is Thursday. If Grimsby and Carrick are still alive, why haven't they come forward? Why haven't they reported to the police that their friend has been murdered? Perhaps they don't know, Watson suggested. If they haven't read the newspapers. Working men in Manchester who haven't heard that someone was found dead with their throat cut. Impossible, Watson. Murder is news, particularly in a district like Castlefield, where everyone knows everyone else's business. No, they know. Which means either they're in hiding because they fear they're next, or... He left the thought unfinished, but Watson understood the implication. Or they were the killers. The journey to Ancoats required crossing through Manchester's commercial heart, where the city wore its prosperity like a new suit that didn't quite fit. The warehouses here were newer, their brick less blackened, their windows intact, and their goods secure behind modern locks. Well-dressed men conducted business on street corners, their voices carrying the clipped efficiency of commerce. Women in better quality clothing than those in Castlefield navigated the pavements with baskets and purpose. Omnibuses rattled past, their advertisements proclaiming the virtues of various soaps and tonics and patent medicines that promised relief from the ailments that industrial living inflicted upon the body. But Ancoats, when they reached it, reminded Watson forcefully that Manchester's prosperity was unevenly distributed at best. This was where the city's textile workers lived, crowded into terraced houses built with such haste and economy that they seemed to sag under their own weight, their brick walls weeping with damp, their courtyards festooned with washing that would never quite dry in air, permanently thick with coal smoke and chemical fumes from the nearby dye works. The smell hit Watson first, a sharp, acrid combination of industrial dyes and human waste, of coal smoke and something sweetly rotten that suggested inadequate sanitation. Children played in the streets despite the cold, their clothing patched and repatched, their faces bearing that peculiar mixture of resilience and resignation that poverty instills early. Women stood in doorways, their arms crossed against the cold, watching the well-dressed strangers with expressions that suggested visitors from the better parts of Manchester were rarely bearers of good news. Thomas Grimsby's lodgings occupied the third floor of a building that tilted noticeably to the left, as if the very ground beneath it had grown tired and was slowly giving up. The stairs were narrow, dark, treacherous, with loose boards and accumulated grime. The smell intensified as they climbed, cooking cabbage and damp plaster and the close scent of too many bodies in too little space. Gregson knocked on the door, marked with a tarnished 3 that hung slightly askew. No answer. He knocked again, harder, the sound echoing in the narrow hallway. "Thomas Grimsby," he called out. "Manchester Police. We need to speak with you about Arthur Welland." Still nothing. But Watson thought he detected something. A creak of floorboards, perhaps, or the sense of presence that sometimes communicates itself despite walls and doors. Someone was inside, someone listening, deciding. Holmes must have sensed it too, for he leaned close to the door and spoke in a voice pitched to carry but not threaten. "Mr. Grimsby, we're not here to arrest you. We're here because Arthur is dead, and we believe you may be in danger. Please, let us help." For a long moment, nothing. Then the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, approaching the door, the scrape of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened a crack, and a face appeared, haggard, unshaven, with eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and terror barely contained. "How do I know you're really police?" The voice was hoarse, damaged by years of breathing chemical fumes in poorly ventilated dyeing sheds. Gregson produced his warrant card, holding it up to the crack. Thomas Grimsby studied it with the paranoid intensity of a man who'd learned to trust nothing, then slowly opened the door wider. The room beyond was small, cramped, painfully bare. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, a small table bearing the remnants of a meal, bread gone hard, cheese developing mould, a single window so grimy that it admitted only the dimmest light, painting everything in shades of grey. And in the corner, barely visible in the gloom, something that made Watson's breath catch. A canvas bag, partially open, revealing what appeared to be a coil of rope, and the glint of metal that might have been a knife. Thomas Grimsby looked like a man being hunted. His clothes were the same ones he'd worn for days, stained with sweat and fear. His hands trembled constantly, making small, helpless gestures in the air, as if trying to ward off something invisible. His eyes darted constantly between the three visitors and the door, calculating distances, measuring escapes. "Arthur's dead," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I knew it. I knew as soon as I heard about the body. It was always going to be Arthur first. He was the weakest, the most visible." "Weakest how?" Holmes asked, his voice gentle now, coaxing rather than demanding. "And visible to whom?" Thomas laughed, a sound without humour. "To him. To the man we were going to kill. He knew, somehow. He knew what we were planning, and he's killing us first, one by one, making us pay for even thinking we could touch him." "Who?" Gregson demanded. "Who is this man?" But Thomas had begun to shake his head, backing away toward the corner where his bag waited. No, I won't say. The moment I say the name, I'm dead. Don't you understand? He has eyes everywhere. He owns half of Manchester. He owns the police, probably. How do I know you're not working for him?" "We're not," Gregson began, but Holmes held up a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Grimsby," Holmes said quietly, "look at me. I'm Sherlock Holmes, from London. I have no connection to Manchester or anyone in it. I'm here solely to find out who killed Arthur Welland and why. You have my word, my professional reputation, which is considerable, that anything you tell me will be used only to stop whoever is hunting you." Thomas's eyes fixed on Holmes's face, searching for deception, and apparently finding none. Some of the tension left his shoulders, though his hands continued their trembling dance. "His name," Thomas whispered, "is Henry Blackwood. He owns Blackwood Mills, 3 of them, employing 2,000 workers, cotton spinning, weaving, the whole operation. He's rich as Croesus and twice as ruthless." He paused, swallowing hard. "And 15 years ago he killed my father." The words fell into the small room like stones into still water, their ripples spreading outward into implications and consequences neither Watson nor Gregson had anticipated. Holmes, however, merely nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "How did he kill your father?" "Not with his own hands," Thomas said bitterly. "That's not how men like Blackwood kill. They do it with machines and indifference and ledgers that show profit above everything else. My father worked in one of his mills, a spinner, skilled, 20 years at the trade. The machines weren't properly maintained. Everyone knew it. The overseers knew it. Blackwood knew it. But repairs cost money, and every penny not spent was another penny in profit. He moved to the window, staring out at the grey afternoon, as if seeing through it to the past. The machine broke. A driving belt snapped while my father was cleaning beneath it. Caught him across the chest, crushed his ribs, punctured his lungs. He died 3 days later, drowning in his own blood, while Blackwood's lawyers were already preparing documents proving the company bore no responsibility, that it was worker error, that my father had violated safety procedures. Watson felt the familiar anger that rose in him whenever he encountered the casual brutality of industrial capitalism, the way it ground up human lives and called the resulting carnage progress or efficiency, or simply the cost of doing business. And Arthur? Holmes prompted. Edward Carrick? What were their connections to Blackwood? Arthur's younger brother worked in the weaving sheds. 14 years old, bright boy, full of promise. Caught his hand in a loom, lost 3 fingers. Blackwood's company gave him £2 in compensation and dismissed him. Can't weave with only 2 fingers and a thumb on your right hand. Last I heard, the boy was begging on Market Street, drunk most days, dead inside. Thomas's voice had gone flat, reciting horrors as if they were merely facts, numbers in a ledger of suffering. As for Eddie's story is different, but the same. His sister worked as a cleaner in one of Blackwood's warehouses. Pretty girl, 17. Blackwood took a fancy to her. You can imagine how that ended. She tried to resist, so he had her dismissed without references. Couldn't find work anywhere in Manchester after that. Blackwood's word travels far. She turned to prostitution to survive. Died of disease within 2 years. The room was silent, except for the distant sounds of Manchester going about its business. Factory whistles, cartwheels on cobblestones, voices calling out in dialects thick as treacle. But inside this cramped space on the 3rd floor of a tilting tenement, the silence held the weight of accumulated injustice, of lives destroyed by a man who would never face consequences through any legal channel. So you decided to become those consequences, Holmes said quietly. It wasn't a question. Thomas turned from the window, and for a moment his face showed not fear, but defiance. The stubborn pride of a man who'd decided that some things mattered more than safety. We made a pact, the 3 of us, last Tuesday night at the Anvil's Crown. We'd each tried to live with what Blackwood had done, tried to move on, to survive, to accept that the rich are untouchable, and justice is just a word they use to keep us in our place. But we couldn't. The rage didn't fade. It grew, year by year, until we could barely see anything else. So you planned his murder, Gregson said, his voice carefully neutral. All 3 of you, working together. No, Thomas said, and his expression became puzzled, almost confused. That's the strange part, Inspector. We didn't plan it together. We each planned it separately. Watson blinked, not understanding. What do you mean? I mean, Thomas said slowly, as if working it out himself, even as he explained it. That night at the pub, we were all drunk and angry and talking about Blackwood, about how someone should make him pay. And then Arthur said something like, I've been thinking about it, really thinking about it, about how it could be done. And Eddie and we both went quiet, because... He paused, his face showing wonder and horror in equal measure. Because we'd both been thinking the same thing, for months, planning it, separately, neither of us knowing the others were doing the same. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that fierce intelligence Watson knew so well. You'd each been planning to kill Henry Blackwood, independently, without knowledge of each other's intentions. And that night, you all discovered this simultaneously. Yes, Thomas breathed. It was like we'd all been possessed by the same demon, all moving toward the same dark purpose without realizing it. We compared notes, carefully, quietly, drunk enough to speak freely, but not so drunk we couldn't think. And we realized we'd all chosen the same night. Tonight, December 15th. Because Black would always visit St. Peter's, the old church they call the Iron Cathedral, because of all the metalwork around it, on the 15th of every month. Some kind of private devotion or penance or whatever lets rich men sleep at night after ruining thousands of lives. He goes alone, late, after the church is closed. He has a key, donated enough money that they gave him private access. And you were all planning to kill him there, Holmes said. Each of you independently planning the same murder at the same place on the same night. 3 men, 1 target, 1 night, Thomas confirmed. We wrote it down. Our pact, our promise to see it through. And then, his voice cracked, and then we found that word written on our pact, observed, in different handwriting. Someone had seen what we wrote. Someone knew. The burnt fragment in Gregson's pocket suddenly took on new, darker significance. Someone had known about the conspiracy before it could be enacted. Someone had written observed as a warning or a threat or simply a record of knowledge that should have remained secret. And now Arthur was dead, his throat cut and his body dumped in an alley like refuse. "Where is Edward Carrick?" Holmes asked urgently. "If you're in danger, so is he." Thomas shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. I went to his boarding house yesterday, but he wasn't there. The landlady said he hadn't been back since Tuesday night. I've been hiding here since then, waiting, expecting every knock at the door to be—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Holmes turned to Gregson. "We need to find Carrick immediately, before midnight, before whatever is planned for the Iron Cathedral reaches its conclusion." He looked back at Thomas. "You're coming with us, into protective custody at the police station. Whether you like it or not, Mr. Grimsby, you're a witness now, possibly the only living witness to whatever happened that night." Thomas didn't argue. His defiance had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and fear. He gathered his few possessions, the bag with its rope and knife, a spare shirt, a photograph of a man who must have been his father, and followed them down the treacherous stairs and out into Manchester's grey afternoon. As they emerged onto the street, Watson noticed Holmes scanning the windows of the surrounding buildings, his eyes sharp and alert. Following his friend's gaze, Watson saw what Holmes had seen. In a third-floor window across the street, a curtain falling back into place, as if someone had been watching and had just withdrawn. Someone knew they were here. Someone was still observing. And in less than 8 hours, midnight would arrive, and whatever dark appointment waited at the Iron Cathedral would come due, with or without the 3 men who'd drunkenly pledged themselves to murder, only to find that murder had other plans. The afternoon had fully surrendered to evening by the time they deposited Thomas Grimsby in a cell at the police station, not as a prisoner, Gregson had assured him, but for his own protection, though the distinction seemed academic to a man watching the door lock behind him. The cell was sparse, but warmer than his lodgings in Ancoats, and Watson had seen to it that he received hot tea and bread, small comforts that did little to ease the terror in his eyes, but at least acknowledged his humanity. Now, as gas lamps were being lit across Manchester and the factories prepared for the evening shift change, Holmes stood before a large map of the city that Gregson had pinned to the wall of his office. His fingers traced lines across the paper, measuring distances, noting landmarks, his mind constructing the geography of conspiracy and murder with the precision of a cartographer mapping unknown territories. "St. Peter's Church," he murmured, tapping a location in the city centre. The so-called Iron Cathedral, built in 1794, if memory serves, and extensively renovated in the 1850s with ornate ironwork added to the exterior, gates, railings, decorative elements. He turned to Gregson. "You know it." "I do," Gregson confirmed. "It's on Peter Street, near the Free Trade Hall. Not the largest church in Manchester, but one of the oldest. The ironwork is indeed extensive, and old, heavily corroded in places. It would certainly fit with those rust fragments you found on Welland's clothing." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "So we can now establish, with reasonable certainty, that Arthur Welland was killed at or very near St. Peter's Church, despite his body being found in an alley a quarter-mile away. The killer took the time to move him, to stage the discovery in a location less immediately connected to the church. That suggests planning, forethought, a desire to obscure the true scene of the crime." He paused, staring at the map. "But it also suggests something else. That whoever killed Welland knew about the plan to murder Henry Blackwood at that very location, knew it well enough to use it as the murder site." Watson, who'd been following the logical progression with the attention of long practice, ventured a theory. Could Blackwood himself have killed Welland? If he somehow learned of the conspiracy, might he not have decided to eliminate the conspirators before they could act? "An excellent hypothesis, Watson, and one we must certainly consider." Holmes resumed his pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. A wealthy mill owner, aware that 3 men plan his murder, decides to strike first. It has a certain poetic justice to it, from his perspective. But there are complications. He held up one long finger. First, the manner of death. Welland's throat was cut in what I determined to be an unpracticed, hesitant manner. Not the work of a professional assassin, and I doubt very much that Henry Blackwood personally engages in such physical violence. Men of his class typically delegate their brutality. A second finger rose. Second, the timing. If Blackwood learned of the plot early enough to plan a preemptive strike, why wait until Tuesday night, the very night before the planned murder? Why not eliminate the threat days or weeks earlier? Perhaps he only just discovered it, Gregson suggested. Perhaps someone informed him recently. "Which brings us to the mysterious observer," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "The person who wrote 'observed' on that scrap of paper. Someone who knew about the conspiracy, who watched it unfold, who documented it, but apparently did nothing to prevent it. Until perhaps they did prevent it, with a knife in an alley at 2 a.m. Watson felt the familiar sensation of the case shifting beneath him, revealing new depths and complications with each revelation. Could the observer be Blackwood himself? Could he have infiltrated their planning somehow? "Unlikely," Holmes replied. "Men like Blackwood don't frequent public houses in Castlefield, mingling with dyers and dock workers. They're too visible, too distinctive. Everyone would remember such an incongruous presence. No, the observer was someone who could blend in, someone whose presence wouldn't be questioned or even particularly noticed." He stopped pacing suddenly, his whole body becoming still in that way that indicated a crucial connection forming in his mind. The barkeeper. Hodge? Gregson's tone was skeptical. What possible motive would he have? Not motive, opportunity. Consider, 3 men meet every Tuesday in his establishment. They've done so for years. He serves them, cleans around them, is present, but not intrusive, visible, but not memorable. The perfect position from which to observe, to overhear, to piece together what they're planning from fragments of conversation heard over weeks or months. Holmes turned to face them fully. And if Hodge overheard their conspiracy, what would he do with that information? A barkeeper in Castlefield, a man who's likely seen his own share of industrial casualties given those missing fingers. Would he go to the police and report 3 working men planning to kill a mill owner who's destroyed their lives? Watson saw it immediately. Or would he go to Blackwood himself, hoping for a reward? Precisely. Men like Hodge survive through careful navigation of Manchester's class system. They're neither workers nor owners, neither poor nor prosperous, occupying that liminal space where information becomes currency. Holmes moved to the window, looking out at the darkening city. If Hodge informed Blackwood of the plot, that would explain the timeline. Blackwood learns of the danger, arranges to meet Welland, perhaps under false pretenses, perhaps with threats or promises, and eliminates him as a warning to the others. "But you said the murder didn't look professional," Watson objected, "that it was unpracticed, hesitant." "Indeed, which suggests Blackwood didn't send a professional killer. He either did it himself, which seems unlikely but not impossible, or he sent someone else, someone inexperienced in murder but loyal enough or desperate enough to carry it out." Holmes's fingers drummed against the window frame, a rare display of agitation. "The problem is we're constructing theories without sufficient data. We need more information, and we need it quickly. It's now 6:30. We have 5.5 hours until midnight." Gregson had been making notes throughout this discussion, his practical policeman's mind cataloguing the threads that needed pulling. "I'll send men to question Hodge more thoroughly, and I'll have officers positioned around St. Peter's, in plain clothes, watching for Blackwood's arrival, or for Edward Carrick, or anyone else who seems suspicious." "Good," Holmes approved. "But subtly, Inspector. If Blackwood is indeed our killer, or if he's hired someone to eliminate the conspirators, we don't want to frighten him off. We want him to proceed with his routine, to arrive at the church, as he apparently does, on the 15th of every month. And if Edward Carrick is still alive, and still planning to attempt the murder despite Welland's death, we need to intercept him before he acts." He paused, his expression darkening. "Though I confess I have grave doubts about Carrick's survival. If the pattern holds, if someone is systematically eliminating the conspirators, then Carrick may already be dead, his body simply not yet discovered." Watson voiced the question that had been troubling him throughout this discussion. "But why? If Blackwood knows about the plot and has eliminated Welland to prevent it, why continue to his church visit tonight? Why not simply alter his routine, avoid the trap entirely?" "Because," Holmes said slowly, working it out even as he spoke, "the trap may not be what we think it is. Consider, 3 men independently plan to kill Blackwood at the same location on the same night. That's an extraordinary coincidence, bordering on impossibility. What if it wasn't coincidence at all? What if someone, our observer, knew what each of them was planning, and somehow ensured they chose the same time and place? Gregson's eyes widened. You're suggesting the conspiracy was manipulated, that someone wanted all three of them there together. I'm suggesting, Holmes said carefully, that we're seeing only part of the picture, that there's a larger design at work here, one we haven't yet fully grasped. He turned from the window, his face set with determination. We need to find Edward Carrick. Watson, you and I will visit his boarding house, speak with the landlady, examine his room if possible. Inspector, continue your inquiries with Hodge and position your men around St. Peter's, and send someone to Henry Blackwood's residence, discreetly. I want to know if he's home, if he seems aware of any danger, if his behaviour suggests anything unusual. As they prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the door of Gregson's office, looking back at the map still pinned to the wall with its network of streets and landmarks, its careful notations of distances and locations. This city, he said quietly, is a monument to human ambition and human suffering in equal measure. It has built fortunes on broken backs and called the result progress. Is it any wonder that such a place breeds conspiracies and murder? Watson, who'd seen his share of both in London, could only nod. Manchester might be the workshop of the world, but workshops were dangerous places, full of sharp edges and crushing weights and mechanisms that cared nothing for the flesh caught within them. The boarding house where Edward Carrick had lived occupied a narrow building on Liverpool Road, squeezed between a chandler's shop and a boarding stable, whose presence contributed a distinct equine aroma to the neighbourhood. The house itself was respectable enough by the standards of transient labour. 3 stories of brick, its windows clean, if not sparkling, its doorsteps scrubbed recently enough to still show wet patches in the corners. The landlady who answered their knock was a Mrs. Pemberton, a woman of indeterminate middle age, whose face bore the particular expression of someone who'd spent decades assessing the reliability of potential tenants and had developed a deep skepticism about human nature in the process. She looked Holmes and Watson up and down with evident disapproval. They were too well dressed to be seeking lodging, which meant they were either debt collectors or law enforcement, neither of which promised anything good. Mrs. Pemberton, Holmes began, producing a card that identified him as a consulting detective. We're seeking information about one of your lodgers, Edward Carrick. Has he been here recently? Her expression hardened further. Is he in trouble? Because I run a respectable house, I do. No criminals, no drunks, no men who can't pay their rent. If Mr. Carrick has done something... He hasn't done anything, Watson interjected gently, recognizing that Holmes's more brusque approach was counterproductive. But we're concerned for his safety. A friend of his has died under suspicious circumstances, and we're worried Mr. Carrick might be in danger. This seemed to mollify her somewhat. Dead, you say? Well, that's terrible, isn't it? Though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Mr. Carrick has been keeping odd company lately. Odd hours, too. Not like him at all. He's usually steady, reliable, always pays his rent on time. When did you last see him? Holmes asked. Tuesday evening, around 7 o'clock. He came in, changed his clothes, then went out again. Said he was meeting friends for a drink. I haven't seen him since. She frowned. His room's paid up through the end of the month, so technically he's not doing anything wrong, but it's unusual. Most lodgers at least sleep here, even if they work odd hours. Might we see his room? Holmes requested. It could help us locate him, ensure he's safe. Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, clearly torn between her natural suspicion and what seemed to be genuine concern for her tenant. "I suppose it couldn't hurt, but don't disturb anything. If Mr. Carrick comes back and finds his things ransacked, he'll have words for me, and rightly so." She led them up narrow stairs to the second floor, producing a ring of keys that jingled with the authority of property management. Carrick's room was at the back of the house, smaller than Welland's had been, but cleaner, more carefully maintained. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked, blankets smoothed, and Watson recognized the habits of a man who'd perhaps served in the army or merchant navy, who'd learned order as a form of survival. The room's sparse furnishings told a story of transience and hard work. A trunk at the foot of the bed, its lock broken, but the hasp still functional. A washstand with a cracked mirror above it. A chair with a jacket draped over its back. Boots by the door, their soles worn through, but carefully mended. The possessions of a man who owned little, but took care of what he had. Holmes moved through the space with the systematic attention Watson had witnessed hundreds of times, his eyes cataloguing every detail, his hands occasionally reaching out to touch something, to test its weight or texture or position. He examined the jacket. Heavy wool, patched at the elbows, pockets empty. He opened the trunk. More clothing, all of it worn but clean, and beneath the clothing a small wooden box. Inside the box, Holmes found letters, dozens of them, written in a feminine hand, tied together with a faded ribbon. He untied them carefully, reading the first few lines of the topmost letter, and Watson saw his expression soften slightly. "From his sister," Holmes said, quietly. "The one Thomas Grimsby mentioned, the one who died. These are from before, cheerful letters, full of small news and affection. He kept them all." He replaced the letters reverently, retying the ribbon. Edward Carrick loved his sister very much, loved her enough to spend 15 years thinking about avenging her death. Beneath the box of letters, Holmes found something else. A knife in a leather sheath, its blade 7 inches long, well maintained, sharp enough to shave with. He drew it partially from its sheath, examined the blade in the lamplight, then resheathed it and placed it back in the trunk. He didn't take his weapon, Holmes observed. If he was planning to kill Blackwood Tuesday night, he didn't take the knife he'd presumably acquired for that purpose. Which suggests... He trailed off, thinking. That he changed his mind, Watson offered. Or that something prevented him from acting. Or, Holmes said darkly, that he's already dead, and has been since Tuesday night, making taking the knife rather moot. They searched the rest of the room thoroughly, but found nothing else of significance. No notes about Blackwood's movements, no copy of the pact the 3 men had made, no indication of where Carrick might have gone after leaving Tuesday evening. The room held the life of a solitary man who worked hard, honoured his past, and had apparently vanished into Manchester's grey streets without trace or warning. As they descended the stairs, Holmes questioned Mrs. Pemberton further. Did Mr. Carrick receive any visitors, any letters or messages in the days before he disappeared? She shook her head. No visitors. He wasn't the sociable type. But now that you mention it, there was a message. Monday afternoon, a boy delivered it. One of those street urchins paid a penny to carry notes, handed me an envelope, said it was for Mr. Carrick, urgent-like. I gave it to him when he came home from work that evening. Do you remember anything about the envelope? The handwriting, the quality of the paper? "Good paper," she said after a moment's thought. "Better than you'd expect for a message to a dock worker. The handwriting was neat, educated. I remember thinking it was odd. Mr. Carrick didn't seem the type to have correspondence with that sort of hand." Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. An educated hand, good paper, a message delivered Monday evening, one day before the three conspirators met at the Anvil's Crown, 2 days before Welland's murder. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton," Holmes said. "You've been most helpful. If Mr. Carrick returns, please send word immediately to Detective Inspector Gregson at the police station. It's vitally important that we speak with him." Outside, the evening had fully arrived, bringing with it a fog that rose from the canals and rivers, thickening the air until gas lamps became dim halos of light, barely penetrating the gloom. Manchester at night was a different city than Manchester by day. More secretive, more dangerous. Its familiar streets transformed into a labyrinth where anything might lurk in the spaces between lights. "Someone sent Carrick a message," Watson said as they walked. "Someone with education and money, judging by the paper. Could it have been Blackwood? Possibly. Or our mysterious observer, whoever they may be." Holmes's voice was tight with frustration. "We're missing something, Watson. Some crucial element that would make sense of all this. 3 men plan to kill the same target on the same night. One of them is murdered before the plan can be enacted. The other 2 disappear. One into hiding, one into complete absence. And all of it revolves around a man who visits a church alone once a month. A man who's built his fortune on the suffering of others and apparently sleeps soundly despite it." They'd reached a corner where 2 streets met, and Holmes paused, orienting himself. "St. Peter's is 3 streets north of here. Let's examine it while we still have some visibility. See what awaited these 3 would-be assassins." The church revealed itself gradually through the fog, its outline solidifying as they approached. A Georgian structure of dark stone, its classical proportions speaking to an age before. Manchester had fully embraced its industrial destiny. But it was the ironwork that immediately commanded attention, exactly as Thomas Grimsby had described. Elaborate gates fronted the church, their bars worked into intricate patterns, their surfaces rough with decades of corrosion. Railings extended along the sides, connecting to smaller gates that led to the churchyard. And everywhere, decorative elements, finials, brackets, ornamental scrollwork, all iron, all old, all bearing that distinctive orange-brown patina of rust. Holmes approached the main gates, examining them closely, his fingers running along the bars. "These would indeed catch clothing," he murmured. "Sharp edges where the rust has flaked away, rough surfaces that would snag fabric. And see here," he pointed to one particular area near the gate's hinge. "Fresh disturbance in the rust. Something or someone brushed against this recently, hard enough to knock away some of the oxidation." Watson looked closer and saw what Holmes had seen, a patch where the rust appeared lighter, newer, as if it had been recently disturbed, and caught in one of the sharp edges, barely visible in the dim light, was a tiny fragment of dark fabric. "Welland's coat was dark," Watson said. "Indeed it was." Holmes carefully extracted the fabric fragment with his tweezers, holding it up to examine it. "Wool, good quality, consistent with what Welland was wearing, so we can confirm he was here, at these gates, presumably on Tuesday night. But whether he came of his own accord, or was brought here against his will, whether he was killed here or merely struggled here before being killed elsewhere. These questions remain unanswered. They walked the perimeter of the church, Holmes noting every detail: the position of gas lamps, the sight lines from nearby buildings, the multiple exits from the churchyard, the covered porch where someone might wait unseen. The church itself was dark and locked, its heavy doors secured with iron bolts that suggested nothing short of a battering ram would gain entry without a key. Blackwood visits here on the 15th of each month, Holmes said, studying the building. Late, after the church is closed, he has a key, according to Grimsby. So he enters alone, presumably for some private devotion or contemplation. That would be the moment of maximum vulnerability, inside the church, alone, with no witnesses. 3 men planning 3 separate assassination attempts would all recognize this as the ideal opportunity. But someone knew they were coming, Watson said. Someone who wrote observed on their pact. Someone who's already killed one of them and possibly both of the others. Holmes nodded grimly. The trap was set, Watson. But I increasingly suspect it wasn't Welland, Grimsby and Carrick who were being trapped. It was someone else. Someone who would come here tonight, expecting... He trailed off, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the church's dark facade. Expecting what? Watson prompted. That's what we need to discover. Holmes pulled out his pocket watch, angling it to catch the light from the nearest gas lamp. It's now 8:15. 3 hours and 45 minutes until midnight. Time enough, perhaps, to answer a few more questions. Come, Watson. We need to pay a visit to Manchester's most successful mill owner. We need to meet Henry Blackwood. As they turned to leave, Watson cast one more glance at the iron cathedral, as St. Peter's was evidently known. In the fog and darkness, with its rusted gates and shadowed porch, it looked less like a place of worship and more like something out of Gothic fiction, a setting where secrets were kept and blood was spilled and prayers went unanswered. Somewhere in this city, Edward Carrick was either hiding or dead. Somewhere, Henry Blackwood went about his evening, perhaps aware of the danger planned for him, perhaps blissfully ignorant. And somewhere, a 4th person, the observer who'd written that single word on a burnt scrap of paper, watched and waited and calculated their next move in a game whose rules Watson still didn't fully understand. The fog thickened, swallowing the church behind them. And above it all, a clock tower began to strike the hour, its bells echoing through Manchester's streets like a countdown to midnight, and whatever dark reckoning awaited there. Henry Blackwood's residence stood in Victoria Park, that enclave of Manchester's wealthiest citizens where the air was noticeably clearer, as if even the coal smoke knew better than to intrude upon the lungs of those who profited from its creation. The house was a monument to Victorian prosperity. 3 stories of pale stone and large windows. Its grounds enclosed by iron railings that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to those surrounding St. Peter's Church, though these were newer, better maintained, their black paint gleaming even in the fog-muted gaslight. A uniformed butler answered Holmes's knock, his expression conveying precisely calibrated disapproval at visitors arriving unannounced at 8:30 in the evening. He examined the card Holmes presented. Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, as if it might be contaminated, then reluctantly admitted them to an entrance hall that spoke of wealth applied without particular imagination. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who'd probably made their fortunes in similarly ruthless fashion. The hall was warm, almost oppressively so, heated by radiators that represented the latest in modern comfort, a luxury paid for by workers who couldn't afford coal for their own meagre fires. "Mr. Blackwood is at dinner," the butler intoned. "I shall inquire if he's receiving visitors." They were left standing in the hall for several minutes, long enough for Watson to study the paintings and note that none of them actually depicted Blackwood himself. These were purchased ancestors, theatrical props meant to suggest old money rather than the industrial fortune that had been made within a single generation. Long enough, too, for Watson to feel his anger building at the contrast between this overheated luxury and Thomas Grimsby's freezing tenement room, between the thickness of the carpets beneath his feet and the thin blankets on Edward Carrick's narrow bed. When the butler returned, his expression suggested that his master's agreement to see them was a great condescension. "Mr. Blackwood will grant you 10 minutes in his study. Please follow me." The study was a masculine retreat of dark wood and leather, its walls lined with books that had the look of being purchased by the yard, rather than read with passion. A fire burned in an ornate marble fireplace, and before it, rising from a leather wingback chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had begun to betray him, stood Henry Blackwood. He was in his 60s, Watson estimated, though well preserved by the standards of his class. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hair grey but still thick, his face bearing the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in industrial environments before wealth had allowed retreat to cleaner air. His eyes were sharp, calculating, the eyes of a man who'd built an empire by seeing opportunities others missed and ruthlessly exploiting them. He wore evening clothes of expensive cut, and a gold watch chain stretched across his waistcoat, a chain that probably cost more than Thomas Grimsby earned in a year. "Mr. Holmes," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the traces of Manchester origins that decades of prosperity hadn't entirely erased. "I confess I'm curious why a London detective arrives unannounced at my home. I'm not aware of requiring your services, nor of being under investigation for anything." "You're not under investigation," Holmes replied smoothly. "At least not by me. But you are the subject of considerable interest in a murder case, Mr. Blackwood. The murder of Arthur Welland, whose body was discovered Wednesday morning with his throat cut." Blackwood's expression didn't change. No surprise, no concern, no recognition of the name. Either he was genuinely ignorant, or he was an exceptionally skilled actor. "I don't know anyone by that name. Why would this person's death be of interest to me?" "Because," Holmes said, settling uninvited into a chair opposite Blackwood's, and gesturing for Watson to do likewise, "Arthur Welland was planning to kill you, along with 2 other men, Thomas Grimsby and Edward Carrick. All 3 of them, independently, had decided you deserved to die for crimes you committed against their families. All 3 had chosen tonight, December 15th, as the night to act. And all 3 had selected St. Peter's Church, where I understand you maintain a regular monthly visitation, as the location for your murder." For the first time, something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Not fear, Watson noted with interest, but something closer to satisfaction, as if Holmes had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "That's quite an accusation," Blackwood said carefully. 3 men planning my murder. Do you have proof of this?" "We have a document bearing the handwriting of all 3, outlining their agreement. We have notebooks documenting your movements with obsessive detail. We have testimony from Thomas Grimsby, currently in protective custody, describing exactly why you were their chosen target. Holmes leaned forward slightly. What we don't have, Mr. Blackwood, is any indication that you were aware of this threat. Were you? Blackwood returned to his chair, settling into it with the deliberation of someone buying time to think. He reached for a crystal decanter on the side table, poured himself a measure of what appeared to be excellent whiskey, and took a slow sip before answering. "Let me tell you something about the textile industry, Mr. Holmes," he said finally. "It's built on margins so thin they'd make your eyes water. Cotton prices fluctuate daily. Labor costs, machinery maintenance, warehouse storage, shipping, every penny counts. And yes, sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes workers are injured or killed. It's tragic, certainly, but it's also inevitable in any industrial operation of scale. I employ 2,000 people across 3 mills. Those 2,000 people feed perhaps 8 or 10,000 more. Wives, children, elderly parents. If my mills close because I can't maintain profitability, what happens to all of them?" "That's not an answer to my question," Holmes said flatly. "Were you aware that 3 men were planning to kill you tonight?" "I was aware," Blackwood admitted, "that certain disgruntled former employees and their relatives harbored ill feelings toward me. One develops a sense for such things when one operates at my level. Threats, both implicit and explicit, are part of the cost of success." He took another sip of whiskey. "But specific knowledge of a plot. 3 men planning assassination for tonight. No, Mr. Holmes, that's news to me." Watson watched the man carefully, using the diagnostic skills he'd honed through years of medical practice to read the subtle signs of deception, changes in breathing, shifts in posture, unconscious gestures that betrayed internal states. And he saw nothing definitive. Blackwood was either telling the truth or was sufficiently practiced in deception that he could control all the usual tells. "Where were you Tuesday night?" Holmes asked abruptly. "Between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning?" "Here," Blackwood replied without hesitation. "Asleep in my bed, as any sensible person would be at that hour. My wife and household staff can confirm it." "Your wife was with you throughout the night?" "We maintain separate bedrooms, Mr. Holmes. My snoring disturbs her rest. But if you're asking whether I left the house during those hours, no, I did not. The house is locked at 11 o'clock each evening, and the butler keeps the keys. He would have noted if I'd required exit or entry at unusual hours." Holmes's expression suggested skepticism, but he shifted approach. "Tell me about your visits to St. Peter's Church. Why do you go there? Why always on the 15th of the month?" For the first time, something that might have been genuine emotion crossed Blackwood's face. Something dark and complicated that Watson couldn't quite pass. "That, Mr. Holmes, is a private matter, between me and my conscience, if you will. I donated substantial funds for the church's restoration. In exchange, I was granted a key and permission for private devotions. What I do there is my own affair. Even if what you do there has made you a target for assassination." "Especially then," Blackwood said firmly. "I won't be driven from my habits by threats from men who can't accept the realities of industrial life. If these 3 wanted me dead badly enough to plan it for months, then they're welcome to try." I'm not a coward, Mr. Holmes. I built my fortune through will and determination, and I don't intend to spend my remaining years cowering in fear. Watson found himself experiencing an unwelcome glimmer of respect for the man, even as he deplored everything Blackwood represented. There was a certain grim courage in his refusal to be intimidated, even if that courage was also breathtaking arrogance. "One of those men is already dead," Holmes said quietly. "Murdered in the very location where they planned to kill you. Doesn't that suggest to you that perhaps your bravado is misplaced? That perhaps someone is using you as bait in a trap you don't fully understand?" "Who?" Blackwood demanded. "Who would do such a thing? And why?" "That," Holmes admitted, "is what I'm trying to determine. But I'm increasingly convinced that Arthur Welland's murder is not what it appears. That there's a larger design at work, one that involves you whether you're aware of it or not." He stood abruptly. "I strongly advise you to cancel your visit to St. Peter's tonight. Stay home, Mr. Blackwood. Let this 15th of December pass without your presence at that church." Blackwood's laugh was short and bitter. "And if I do? If I hide here behind locked doors and iron gates? What message does that send? That Henry Blackwood can be frightened off by dead workers and their grievances? That any man with a grudge need only make threats to control my movements?" He shook his head. "No, Mr. Holmes. I'll be at St. Peter's at midnight, as I am every 15th. If someone wants to kill me there, they're welcome to try. But I won't be driven away by fear." Holmes studied him for a long moment, and Watson could see his friend weighing options, calculating probabilities, attempting to predict how this night would unfold. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Very well. But know this, Mr. Blackwood. The police will be present, watching. If anything occurs, if anyone attempts violence against you, they'll intervene immediately." "I wouldn't expect otherwise," Blackwood replied, "though I trust your men will be discreet. I prefer my devotions to be private." As the butler showed them out, Watson caught a glimpse of a woman watching from the top of the grand staircase. Mrs. Blackwood, presumably, her face pale and worried in the gaslight. She disappeared quickly when she realized she'd been seen, but not before Watson noted the fear in her eyes. Whatever her husband's courage or stubbornness, she at least understood that tonight might bring more than private devotions. Outside, the fog had thickened further, reducing visibility to perhaps 10 feet. Gas lamps became isolated islands of dim light in an ocean of grey, and the sounds of the city, always present in Manchester, seemed muted, distorted, as if reaching them from a great distance. "He's lying," Watson said as they walked, "about not knowing of the threat. I'd stake my medical reputation on it." "Oh, almost certainly," Holmes agreed. "But lying about what, specifically? About knowing 3 men planned to kill him tonight? Or about something else entirely?" He paused at a corner, orienting himself in the fog. "There are too many pieces that don't fit, Watson. Blackwood's insistence on keeping his appointment despite clear danger. His refusal to specify why he visits the church. The message sent to Edward Carrick Monday evening from someone with education and good stationery. The word observed, written by a 4th party who knew about the conspiracy. Could Blackwood have written it? Watson suggested. Could he have known about the plot all along, and written that word as, what? A warning? A threat? The handwriting would need to be compared, but it's possible. Holmes resumed walking, his pace quickening despite the poor visibility. But if Blackwood knew about the plot, Why kill only Welland? Why not eliminate all 3 threats? And why kill Welland at the very location where Blackwood himself will appear tonight? They'd been walking for several minutes when Watson realized they were being followed. Nothing obvious, just the sense of footsteps behind them, maintaining distance, pausing when they paused. He touched Holmes's arm, nodded back toward the fog-shrouded street behind them. Holmes stopped, turned, peered into the grey murk. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice carrying that particular authority that expected obedience. "We know you're there." For a moment, nothing. Then a figure emerged from the fog, a man of medium height, powerfully built, his face shadowed by a cap pulled low. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone trying to appear non-threatening while remaining ready for violence. "Edward Carrick," Holmes said, and it wasn't a question. The man stopped perhaps 8 feet away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to run if necessary. In the poor light, Watson could make out a face ravaged by sleeplessness and fear, eyes that darted constantly to side streets and doorways, hands that remained in his coat pockets where they might be gripping weapons. "How did you know?" Carrick's voice was rough, damaged by years of breathing dock air, thick with coal dust and industrial effluent. "You've been following us since we left Blackwood's house," Holmes replied, "waiting to see where we'd go, what we'd learn. You were watching the house when we arrived, weren't you? Watching to see if Blackwood was home, if he seemed aware of danger, if tonight's appointment would proceed as planned." Carrick didn't deny it. "Is he going? To the church?" "He is, despite being warned of the danger, despite knowing that one of your co-conspirators is already dead. Henry Blackwood will be at St. Peter's at midnight." Holmes took a step closer, his voice softening slightly. "Where have you been, Mr. Carrick? Thomas Grimsby has been hiding in terror, certain that whoever killed Arthur Welland would come for him next. Yet you've simply disappeared. Why?" "Because I knew," Carrick said, and his voice broke slightly. "As soon as I heard about Arthur, and you hear everything in this city if you listen, street talk travels faster than telegrams. I knew someone had discovered our plan. Someone who wanted to stop us, or use us, or... I don't know. But I knew going home would be death. Knew staying visible would be death." "So you've been hiding? Where?" "Places. Empty warehouses. Under canal bridges. Places where dock workers go when they've nowhere else. Places where no one asks questions because everyone there has their own reasons for hiding." His hands emerged from his pockets, empty to Watson's relief, and rubbed at his face with weary futility. "I should run. Get out of Manchester entirely, go to Liverpool or Leeds or somewhere Blackwood's reach doesn't extend. But I can't. My sister..." He choked on the words. "She died because of him. Died in misery and shame because he took what he wanted and discarded her like rubbish. I've been living with that for 15 years, Mr. Holmes. 15 years of rage eating me alive. How do I just walk away?" Watson felt his earlier anger at Blackwood crystallize into something harder, colder. This was the human cost of industrial prosperity. Not just the workers crushed by machines, but the families destroyed by men who saw their employees as resources to be exploited in every possible way. "If you go to St. Peter's tonight," Holmes said carefully, "you'll be arrested. The police are watching. Inspector Gregson knows about the conspiracy, knows you are planning Blackwood's murder. Your only chance of avoiding the gallows is to come with us now, voluntarily, and testify to what happened. Tell us everything you know about that night at the Anvil's Crown, about the message you received Monday evening, about who else might have known of your plans. And then watch Blackwood walk free. Carrick's laugh was hollow. Watch him continue to ruin lives while I rot in a cell? What kind of justice is that? The only kind that doesn't end with your neck in a noose, Holmes said bluntly. You haven't killed anyone, Mr. Carrick. Whatever you planned, you didn't act on it. But if you go to the church tonight with murder in your heart, you'll hang regardless of whether you succeed. Is that the legacy you want? Is that how you want your sister remembered, as the excuse for your execution? The words hit home. Watson could see it in the way Carrick's shoulders slumped, the way his defiance crumbled into exhausted resignation. He was a man who'd sustained himself on rage for 15 years, and now, with the object of that rage finally within reach, he was being asked to surrender it. Who killed Arthur? Carrick asked quietly. Do you know? Not yet, Holmes admitted. But I will, by morning. I give you my word, whoever murdered your friend will face justice. But that justice must come through law, not through revenge taken in a church at midnight. Carrick stood silent for a long moment, the fog swirling around him, the distant sounds of Manchester's night, providing a melancholy soundtrack to his internal struggle. Finally, he nodded. All right. I'll come with you. But I want to be there tonight, at the church. I want to see how this ends. That, Holmes said, can be arranged. Watson, would you escort Mr. Carrick to the police station? Inform Inspector Gregson that we now have all 3 conspirators accounted for. 1 dead, 2 in custody for their own protection. I have 1 more inquiry to make before midnight arrives. Where are you going? Watson asked. Holmes smiled grimly. Back to the Anvil's Crown. I have questions for Mr. Hodge, and I find that barkeepers are more forthcoming late in the evening when their establishments are full, and their attention divided. Besides, I want to see that corner table, where 3 friends made a pact that cost one of them his life. I want to understand the geography of that night, the sequence of events, the moment when conspiracy became murder. Watson wanted to object, wanted to insist on accompanying his friend, but he recognized the look in Holmes's eyes. This was the moment in an investigation when Holmes needed to be alone, to think without distraction, to reconstruct events in his mind with the clarity that solitude provided. Be careful, Watson said simply. Always, my dear Watson. Though I confess careful is a relative term when one is investigating a murder conspiracy in a city where the fog is thick enough to cut with a knife. Holmes gave them both a brief nod, then disappeared into the grey murk with the decisiveness of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. Watson and Carrick stood together in the fog, 2 men from vastly different worlds brought together by murder, and the brittle hope that justice might still exist somewhere beneath Manchester's soot-stained surface. This friend of yours, Carrick said as they began walking toward the police station. This Holmes, can he really solve this? Can he really find who killed Arthur? Watson thought about all the impossible cases he'd witnessed Holmes unravel, all the mysteries that had seemed impenetrable, until Holmes applied his peculiar genius to their solution. If anyone can, he said with confidence, it's Sherlock Holmes. The man sees things the rest of us miss, makes connections that seem impossible until he explains them. If there's truth to be found in this case, he'll find it. Above them, a church clock began to strike 10. 2 hours until midnight. 2 hours until whatever had been set in motion that drunken night at the Anvil's Crown reached its inevitable conclusion at the Iron Cathedral. And somewhere in the fog-wrapped streets of Manchester, Sherlock Holmes walked alone, piecing together the final elements of a puzzle that had cost one man his life and threatened to claim more before dawn arrived. The city's factories rumbled on, indifferent to human drama. The fog thickened, and midnight drew closer with the inexorability of justice or revenge, those two concepts that seemed, in this grey industrial city, to be nearly indistinguishable. The fog had transformed Manchester into something from a fever dream by the time midnight approached. St. Peter's Church loomed out of the grey murk like a ship emerging from Arctic ice, its dark stone facade seeming to absorb what little light the gas lamps provided, its iron gates and railings glistening with condensed moisture that made them appear almost alive, as if the metal itself were sweating in anticipation of what was to come. Watson stood in the shadows of a doorway across the street, his coat collar turned up against the penetrating damp, his breath forming small clouds that merged immediately with the surrounding fog. Beside him, silent and tense, stood Edward Carrick, technically in police custody, but permitted by Gregson to witness the night's conclusion. Around them, invisible in the fog but present nonetheless, were 6 constables positioned at strategic points around the church, waiting for whatever midnight would bring. Holmes had returned to the police station at 11:30, his face bearing that expression of grim satisfaction that Watson had learned meant he'd solved the puzzle, that all the pieces had finally arranged themselves into a coherent picture. But he'd refused to explain, had simply insisted that they all proceed to St. Peter's and wait. The truth, he'd said cryptically, will reveal itself at midnight. All we need do is watch. Thomas Grimsby had also been brought from his cell over his vehement protests, and now stood with Inspector Gregson near the church's northern wall, his eyes wide with terror, his whole body trembling despite the constable assigned to protect him. He'd begged to be left in the safety of his cell, had sworn he wanted nothing to do with whatever was about to occur. But Holmes had insisted. All 3 conspirators needed to be present, he'd said. All 3 needed to witness the resolution of what they'd set in motion. The church clock began its laboured climb toward midnight, each tick audible in the fog-muffled silence. Watson found himself counting 11:45, 11:46, 11:47. Time moving with agonizing slowness toward some appointment that felt increasingly like an execution. At 11:53, a carriage arrived, its horses' hooves muffled by the fog, its lamps casting weak yellow cones of light that barely penetrated 3 feet ahead. It stopped before the church gates, and Henry Blackwood descended, moving with the careful dignity of a man who refused to show fear, even if he felt it. He wore a long black coat and carried a walking stick. Whether for support or defence, Watson couldn't determine. For a moment he stood before the gates, looking up at the church, his face unreadable in the poor light. Then he produced a key, unlocked the gates with practised efficiency, and walked through, leaving them open behind him. He proceeded to the church's main door, unlocked it as well, and disappeared inside. A moment later, lights appeared in the windows. Candles, Watson thought, their warm glow strange and almost welcoming in the cold fog. "What's he doing?" Carrick whispered, his voice tight, with barely controlled rage. "Just going about his devotions as if nothing's wrong. as if Arthur wasn't murdered here 3 nights ago. Patience, Watson murmured, though he shared Carrick's confusion. What was Blackwood doing? Did he truly believe himself safe? Or was there something else happening here, some element Watson couldn't see? At 11:58, another figure emerged from the fog, moving with swift purpose toward the open gates. Watson tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the service revolver he'd brought, despite Holmes's assurance that it wouldn't be needed. Beside him, Carrick sucked in his breath sharply. But it wasn't an assassin approaching the church. It was Holmes himself, walking openly up the path, passing through the gates without hesitation, climbing the steps to the main door. He paused there, turned to look back at the street, as if confirming that everyone was in position, then entered the church. "What's he doing?" Watson breathed, fighting the urge to run after his friend. This wasn't the plan. Holmes was supposed to be observing, not participating. "Gregson, what's happening?" But the inspector looked as confused as Watson felt. "I don't know." He said to wait, to watch. He said the truth would reveal itself at midnight. The clock struck 12, its bells echoing through the fog with mournful resonance. 1 chime, 2, 3. Watson counted them mechanically while his mind raced through terrible possibilities. 4, 5, 6. On the 7th chime, another figure appeared in the fog, moving toward the church with swift, furtive purpose. This one was smaller, slighter, dressed in dark clothing that helped them blend with the night. They moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who knew exactly where they were going and why. "Now!" Gregson hissed, and the constables moved, emerging from their positions, converging on the church gates. But they were too slow. The figure had already passed through the gates, was already climbing the church steps, was already pushing open the door that Blackwood and Holmes had left unlocked. For a moment, they were silhouetted against the candlelight within, a small figure, almost childlike in stature, and then they were inside, and the door closed behind them. Watson ran, propriety and caution abandoned, in favour of fear for his friend. He reached the gates ahead of Gregson and the constables, sprinted up the path, took the steps 2 at a time. Behind him, he heard Carrick and Grimsby following, heard Gregson shouting orders, heard the sound of whistles being blown to summon more police. He burst through the church door into a scene that would remain etched in his memory forever. The interior of St. Peter's was illuminated by perhaps 50 candles, their flames casting dancing shadows across walls and columns, creating a space that seemed caught between the sacred and the profane. Henry Blackwood stood before the altar, his walking stick raised defensively, his face pale but determined. Holmes stood to one side, his posture relaxed, almost casual, as if he were merely an interested observer at a theatrical performance. And between them, facing Blackwood with a knife held in a trembling hand, stood a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, slight of build, her face bearing the kind of beauty that poverty and hardship hadn't, yet entirely erased. Her hair was dark, pulled back severely, and her clothing was respectable but worn, the dress of a working woman, a clerk or shop assistant perhaps, someone who earned her living through modest labour. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, eyes burning with rage and grief and something close to madness, fixed on Blackwood with an intensity that was almost physical. "Emily," Blackwood said, and his voice carried a complexity of emotion Watson couldn't immediately pass. Emily, put down the knife, please. This isn't necessary. Isn't necessary? The young woman's laugh was sharp, broken. You killed my father. You destroyed my family. You've killed how many others with your machines and your indifference? And you think this isn't necessary? Watson heard Carrick's sharp intake of breath behind him, heard Grimsby's confused whisper. Who is she? Holmes answered, his voice calm, almost gentle. This is Emily Hodge, daughter of the barkeeper at the Anvil's Crown, and, if I'm not mistaken, also the person who wrote Observed on the pact made by Messrs. Grimsby, Welland, and Carrick. Emily's eyes flicked toward Holmes, then back to Blackwood, her knife never wavering. He told me what they were planning. My father. He heard them that night, heard them agreeing to kill Blackwood, and he told me because he thought I'd want to warn the police to stop them. But I didn't want to stop them. Her voice broke. I wanted to join them. Understanding crashed over Watson like a cold wave. The pieces that had seemed so disconnected suddenly assembled themselves into a coherent picture, terrible in its clarity. Your father also worked in one of Blackwood's mills, Holmes said. Not a question, but a statement. Years ago, before he lost his fingers and took up keeping a pub, and the injury that cost him those fingers, that was Blackwood's doing, wasn't it? Inadequate safety measures, poor maintenance, the same pattern repeated across dozens of incidents. Emily nodded jerkily, her whole body vibrating with suppressed emotion. He never speaks of it, never complains, he just survives. Like all of us survive, accepting that this is how the world works, that men like Blackwood, she spat the name, can destroy lives without consequence, because they have money and power, and we have nothing. So when you learned that 3 men were planning Blackwood's murder, Holmes continued, his tone still gentle, still coaxing, you saw an opportunity, a chance to accomplish what you'd perhaps dreamed of but never dared attempt. You wrote Observed on their pact, not as a threat to them, but as a promise to yourself. You'd be there, you'd watch, and if they failed, he trailed off meaningfully. If they failed, I'd finish it. Emily finished. I'd make sure justice was done, one way or another. But something went wrong, Watson said, the sequence of events crystallizing in his mind. Arthur Welland, you killed him. I didn't mean to. The cry tore from Emily's throat, anguished and raw. I was here Tuesday night, waiting, watching from the shadows. I saw Arthur arrive early, too early, an hour before midnight. He was nervous, pacing, checking his pocket watch, and then, she paused, swallowing hard. And then Mr. Blackwood arrived, not at midnight, but at 11. I didn't understand why, but suddenly they were both here, and Arthur was approaching him, and I thought Arthur was going to do it, going to kill him right then. But he wasn't, Holmes said quietly. Was he, Mr. Blackwood? Blackwood lowered his walking stick slowly, his face grey with exhaustion, or resignation, or perhaps relief that the truth was finally emerging. No, I'd sent Arthur a message Monday evening asking him to meet me here Tuesday night at 11. I told him I knew about the conspiracy, that I wanted to speak with him privately to understand why he hated me enough to plan my death. You knew? Gregson's voice was sharp with disbelief. You knew they were planning to kill you. Not specifically, but I'd heard rumors, felt the weight of hostile eyes watching me. I made inquiries, learned about 3 men who met regularly at the Anvil's Crown, men with grievances against me. I had them followed, had my people observe them. Blackwood's expression was bitter. "It's not difficult to buy information in Manchester, Inspector. Everyone has a price." "So you invited Arthur Welland here to confront him," Holmes said. "To what? Threaten him? Bribe him? Convince him to abandon the plot?" "To offer him compensation," Blackwood said tiredly. "Real compensation, not the pittance the company paid his brother. Money to get the boy off the streets, to give him training in some trade he could manage with his remaining fingers. I wanted to show Arthur that I wasn't the monster he'd made me in his mind, that I could be reasonable, that violence wasn't necessary." Watson felt his earlier respect for Blackwood curdle into something closer to disgust. The man had crushed Arthur's brother, destroyed his future, and now thought a late payment of conscience money would absolve him. But Emily didn't know that, Holmes said, bringing the focus back to the young woman who still held her knife pointed at Blackwood's chest. She saw what appeared to be an assassination attempt beginning, and "I panicked," Emily whispered. "I thought if Arthur killed Mr. Blackwood, he'd hang for it. All three of them would hang. They were all part of the conspiracy. And I thought if I could stop Arthur, if I could warn Mr. Blackwood, then maybe—" She shook her head. "I don't know what I thought. I just ran toward them, and Arthur saw me, and he must have thought I was part of Blackwood's security, that I was there to stop him. He grabbed at me, and I had the knife. I'd brought it in case I needed to finish what the others started. And we struggled, and then—" Her voice failed completely. Tears streamed down her face, catching the candlelight. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to stop him. But the knife went in, and he looked so surprised, and then there was blood everywhere, and Mr. Blackwood was shouting, and Arthur fell against the gates, those terrible rusty gates, and I just ran." "You left the body here," Holmes said, "and Blackwood moved it to the alley off Swan Street, to distance the murder from the church, to protect himself from investigation into why a man was killed at the site of his private devotions." Blackwood didn't deny it. "I couldn't have police swarming the church, asking questions, discovering that I'd arranged a meeting with someone who was planning my murder. The scandal alone would have destroyed my reputation. So yes, I moved the body. I burned the pact they'd written, or tried to, though I was interrupted before I could finish. And I went home and tried to pretend it never happened. While Arthur Welland's body lay in a frozen alley, Carrick's voice was thick with rage, and his friends lived in terror, thinking someone was hunting them. I didn't know about the others," Blackwood protested. "I knew Arthur was part of some group, but not who they were, not where to find them. I hoped they'd hear about Arthur's death and abandon whatever they'd planned." "But Emily knew," Holmes said. "Emily knew about all three conspirators because her father had told her. And she knew she'd killed the wrong man, killed someone who'd been trying to talk peace rather than commit murder. That guilt has been eating at you, hasn't it, Miss Hodge?" Emily's knife hand dropped slightly, her whole body sagging. "I killed an innocent man. Or not innocent. None of us are innocent, are we? But a man who wasn't trying to hurt anyone at that moment. And I let Mr. Blackwood move the body, let him burn the evidence, because I was too frightened to confess what I'd done. I've been living with it for 3 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, thinking about Arthur Welland's face when the knife went in." "So you came here tonight," Holmes continued, "planning to finish what Arthur never got to start, planning to kill Henry Blackwood, and perhaps, in doing so, to punish yourself as well. A murder-suicide was it? One final act of justice or vengeance, or whatever you want to call it. Emily raised the knife again, but the gesture was hollow, defeated. Why shouldn't I? What do I have to live for? I'm a murderer. I killed a man who'd never done anything to me. And men like Blackwood, the name was poison on her tongue, men like him continue to profit from our suffering, continue to destroy lives without consequence. Emily, Holmes said, and now his voice carried genuine compassion. You're 20 years old. You made a terrible mistake born of rage and fear and the desperate desire to see justice done in a world that seems devoid of it. But adding another death to the tally won't heal anything. It won't bring back Arthur Welland. It won't restore your father's fingers, or Edward Carrick's sister, or Thomas Grimsby's father. It will only add your own life to the list of casualties this city's industrial machine has created. He should pay, Emily said, but her voice was weakening, the knife wavering in her grip. Someone should make him pay. He will pay, Holmes assured her, for moving a body, for destroying evidence, for criminal negligence in the death of your father and countless others. The law may not be perfect, Miss Hodge, but it exists, and Detective Inspector Gregson is a good man who'll see that charges are brought. Gregson stepped forward carefully, his hands visible, non-threatening. It's true, miss. What you've told us tonight, that's confession to manslaughter, not murder. You didn't intend to kill Mr. Welland. A jury might show mercy, particularly given the circumstances. But if you kill Mr. Blackwood now, in cold blood, with all of us as witnesses, that's murder, pure and simple, and for that you'll hang. The knife trembled violently now. Emily's face was a mask of grief and exhaustion, and the terrible realization that all paths forward led through suffering. I'm so tired, she whispered. I'm so tired of being angry, tired of hating, tired of watching people like my father accept their broken bodies and ruined lives as if it's just the natural order of things. I know, Holmes said gently, but this isn't the way. Put down the knife, Emily. Let us help you. For a long moment, the tableau held. Emily with her knife, Blackwood frozen before the altar, Holmes and Watson and Gregson positioned carefully around them, the constables crowding the doorway behind, the candles guttered in unseen draughts, their flames dancing wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the ancient walls. Then, with a sound that was half sob, half sigh, Emily let the knife fall. It clattered against the stone floor with a sound like a bell tolling, and she collapsed to her knees, her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with the force of her weeping. Holmes was there immediately, kneeling beside her, his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort from a man not known for physical demonstrations of sympathy. It's over, he said quietly. It's finished now. Gregson moved forward to take Emily into custody, his touch gentle, despite the handcuffs he produced. As he led her past Watson toward the door, she looked up at Edward Carrick, who stood frozen, staring at her with an expression of complex emotion. I'm sorry, she said to him. I'm sorry about your sister. I'm sorry I couldn't. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to finish it. Carrick said nothing, but Watson saw tears on the weathered face of the dock worker, saw the way his massive hands clenched and unclenched, as if trying to grasp something that kept slipping away. As Emily was led from the church, Holmes turned to face Henry Blackwood, who remained standing before the altar, his walking stick now serving its intended purpose of supporting a body that seemed suddenly frail, diminished. "You'll face charges as well," Holmes said, his voice cold now, stripped of the compassion he'd shown Emily. "For moving the body, destroying evidence, criminal negligence in multiple workplace deaths. I'll see to it personally that every incident in your mills is investigated, every suspicious injury examined, every family who suffered because of your cost-cutting and corner-cutting gets their day in court." "I built this city," Blackwood said, "but there was no conviction in it, only exhaustion. Me and men like me. We made Manchester what it is." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "And that's precisely the problem. You built an empire on broken bodies and called it progress. You created wealth by destroying lives and called it industry. Well, Mr. Blackwood, the bill has come due. It may have taken 15 years, but justice, imperfect and delayed though it is, has finally arrived." As they emerged from the church into the fog-wrapped night, Watson found himself standing beside Thomas Grimsby and Edward Carrick, two men who'd planned murder and found instead only more grief, more complexity, more questions about what justice actually meant in a city like Manchester. "Is it over?" Grimsby asked, his voice small, bewildered. "Is it really finished?" Holmes paused, looking back at the church with its iron gates and corroded railings, at the building that had witnessed so much pain and rage distilled into one terrible moment of violence. "For you, yes, you're free to go. No charges will be brought for conspiracy. You never actually attempted the crime, and given the circumstances, I suspect any jury would be sympathetic to your motivations, if not your methods." "But Emily," Carrick said, "that girl, she'll go to prison." "Very likely," Holmes acknowledged, "but she'll live. She'll have a chance to make something of her life after she's served her time. That's more than Arthur Welland got. More than your sister got, Mr. Carrick. More than Grimsby's father got. Sometimes survival, imperfect and compromised as it is, has to be enough." They stood together in the fog, 7 men connected by a case that had revealed the fault lines running through Manchester's industrial prosperity, the human cost of the wealth that built palaces and funded empires. Above them, the church clock struck 1, marking the passage into a new day, a new beginning, or perhaps merely the continuation of patterns too entrenched to break. "Come," Watson said finally, placing a hand on Holmes's shoulder. "We've done what we came to do. Let's go home." The fog swallowed them as they walked away from the iron cathedral, that church where 3 men had planned murder, where 1 young woman had committed manslaughter, where Henry Blackwood had conducted his private devotions to a conscience that apparently still troubled him despite decades of ruthless business practice. Manchester continued, its rhythms around them, factories preparing for the dawn shift, night workers making their weary way home, the city that never truly slept, simply shifting from one mode of exhaustion to another. The case of the Iron Cathedral was solved, its mysteries unravelled, its truth finally exposed to the cold light of investigation. But as Watson walked through the fog beside his friend, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd solved a crime without actually achieving justice. Emily Hodge would face trial. Henry Blackwood would face charges. Arthur Welland was dead. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would change the fundamental realities that had led to this tragedy. The mills would continue grinding, the workers would continue suffering, the wealthy would continue profiting. And somewhere in Manchester's endless streets, another Emily, another Thomas, another Edward, was even now beginning to contemplate whether justice delayed and denied might be worth pursuing through other means. "What are you thinking, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice barely audible above the fog-muffled sounds of the city. "I'm thinking," Watson replied slowly, "that we solved the crime, but not the problem. That we've arrested the guilty, but left the system that created them entirely intact." Holmes nodded grimly. "Welcome to the limits of detection, my dear Watson. I can solve murders. I can unravel conspiracies. I can expose the guilty and exonerate the innocent. But changing the world that makes such crimes inevitable—" He shook his head. "That requires something more than logic and observation. That requires a revolution I'm neither qualified nor inclined to lead." They walked on through the Manchester night, two men from London who'd come north to solve a murder, and had found instead a mirror reflecting England's industrial soul, brilliant and brutal, productive and destructive, creating wealth and misery in equal measure. Behind them, St. Peter's Church stood silent, its iron gates rusting, its stones cold, its candles extinguished. The iron cathedral had given up its secrets. But the city around it, the city of cotton and coal, of fortunes and failures, of men who built and men who were broken in the building, that city kept its mysteries still. The fog thickened as dawn approached, and Manchester disappeared into grey, becoming nothing but sound and suggestion, a city felt rather than seen. And in that murk, Watson thought, perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps Manchester was always meant to be sensed rather than observed, its truths too dark and complicated to bear full illumination. They walked toward the station, toward the train that would carry them back to London, back to cases that would seem simpler, because they didn't force contemplation of England's industrial soul. The case of the Iron Cathedral was closed, but its questions would linger long after the fog finally lifted.